Picture London at the turn of the century. The carriages are still rattling through cobblestone streets, gas lamps flicker in dim alleys, and yet new electric lights are beginning to hum above the grand boulevards. The year is 1901. Queen Victoria has just passed away after reigning for what felt like several centuries. Okay, 63 years, but that's longer than most houseplants live. And her son Edward VII has ascended the throne. With him came a new vibe, less stiff, more social, and far more invested in leisure and pleasure. Victorians had worked hard and frowned harder. Edwardians, in contrast, were about to laugh, sing and clap until their gloves wore thin. London was at its busiest and boldest. Nearly 7 million people crammed into the city, making it the largest metropolis in the world. It was a place where fortunes were made, fashions were flaunted, and fog was free of charge. But more importantly, it was a place where people craved entertainment. After all, life was stressful, the working day was long, industrial smoke painted the skyline a permanent shade of misery, and one's doctor might still prescribe brandy for anything from headaches to heartbreak. People needed somewhere to escape, and the theatre offered exactly that, and escape they did. The Edwardian period was marked by a surge of leisure activities, but theatre dominated the cultural imagination. Cinema was in its infancy. Music halls were rowdy, and pubs were crowded. But nothing quite beat the feeling of stepping into a glowing theatre where the worries of the day could be traded for a world of music, laughter and drama. Theatres weren't just buildings, they were beacons. In a city buzzing with new inventions, shifting morals and endless gossip, theatre became the gathering place of the age. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. One of the biggest shifts in Edwardian society was the rise of the middle class. Thanks to industrial expansion, clerks, teachers, shopkeepers and office workers were earning enough disposable income to afford more than just bread and coal. They wanted hats, they wanted bicycles, and most dangerously, they wanted tickets to see the latest sensation in the West End. This was revolutionary. Theatre, which had long been the playground of the aristocracy and the intellectuals, was suddenly being invaded by people who worked at desks by day and wanted a laugh by night. Imagine the thrill. Mr. and Mrs. Ordinary could sit in a velvet seat under golden chandeliers, pretending for a few hours that they were aristocrats themselves, as long as they ignored the cheap meat pie repeating on them from dinner. Technology helped fuel the craze. Electric lights transformed theatres into dazzling palaces. Unlike the dim and smoky gas lamps of earlier decades, electric lighting made theatres glitter, sparkle, and most importantly, less flammable. If you went to a play in 1800, there was always a non-zero chance you'd leave with your eyebrows singed. By 1901, your biggest risk was being blinded by the sheer wattage bouncing off sequined costumes. Electricity didn't just illuminate stages, it illuminated society's hunger for spectacle. And speaking of spectacle, Edwardian London was hungry for it in every sense. This was the age of imperial confidence. Britain ruled over a quarter of the globe, and that swagger trickled down into popular culture. Plays and musicals often reflected the grandeur of the empire, filling stages with exotic backdrops and costumes, sometimes researched, often improvised. Accuracy was not their strong suit. To Edwardian audiences, theatre wasn't just entertainment, it was reassurance that they were living in the centre of the world. But while the upper crust of London basked in this imperial pride, the theatre craze also showed something new, a loosening of Victorian rigidity. Edward VII himself was a lover of the arts, society, and frankly fun. He enjoyed theatre, parties, and food with such enthusiasm that he set the tone for his age. If Queen Victoria's unofficial motto had been "We are not amused," Edward's could have been "Why not be amused, darling?" Theatres mirrored that shift, leaning toward lighter, more comedic productions that embraced wit and music over the sombre moralizing of the Victorian stage. Outside the theatres, London itself was changing rapidly. The underground had been operating since 1863, but the Edwardian period saw it expand, ferrying eager theatregoers directly to the West End. Trains and trams carried people from the suburbs, meaning theatre was no longer the privilege of those who lived in walking distance of Drury Lane. Cafes and restaurants popped up near theatres, providing before and after show haunts. Imagine the thrill of sipping cocoa while discussing whether the leading man's wig was glued on straight. The theatre experience was becoming an entire evening, not just a 2-hour diversion. And here's where humour sneaks in. Edwardian Londoners weren't just hungry for stories, they were also hungry for status. Theatre tickets became a badge of taste, proof that you were keeping up with the times. Owning a programme booklet was like flashing a social media check-in today. Yes, darling, I saw the show last night. Translation: I'm cultured, I'm connected, and I somehow survived the suffocating perfume of the woman in the seat next to me. It's worth remembering that not everyone was on board with this craze. Moralists complained that theatre corrupted the masses, that women in chorus lines were far too visible, and that laughter itself was a slippery slope toward ruin. But for most Londoners, the opposite was true. The theatre was salvation. For a few shillings you could forget the soot, the stress, and the stern lectures of your landlady. You could laugh, sigh, and lose yourself in another world. So, as the curtain rises on Edwardian London in 1901, we see a city poised between tradition and transformation, a monarch who encouraged merriment, a middle class demanding entertainment, and a technological revolution, making theatres brighter and safer than ever before. If you weren't at the theatre, were you even Edwardian? Or just someone waiting for your hat to go out of fashion? If you were wandering through London in the early 1900s, you might have noticed something peculiar. Every time you blinked, another theatre seemed to appear. By the Edwardian era, the city was turning into a veritable garden of theatres, sprouting with the enthusiasm of weeds after a rainstorm. Or, to put it more bluntly, theatres multiplied faster than Victorians sprouted sideburns, and let's be honest, those sideburns could colonize a man's face in record time. Why this sudden boom? The Edwardian period was the perfect storm of money, demand, and technology. Investors realized that theatres were not just cultural institutions, but also profitable machines. Build one in the right place, put in some plush seats, toss on a musical comedy, and voila, the profits rolled in faster than the fog rolling down Fleet Street. Theatre became a business as much as an art form, and business was booming. The West End became ground zero for this construction craze. Shaftesbury Avenue, already home to some grand Victorian theatres, turned into a glittering boulevard of performance palaces. From 1890 to 1910, dozens of new theatres opened, each one trying to outdo the others in size, decoration, and sheer opulence. Marble foyers, gilded balconies, velvet curtains. These weren't just venues, they were monuments to excess. Some looked more like opera houses than playhouses, designed to impress before the actors even spoke a single line. But here's the twist. It wasn't only the big palaces multiplying. Smaller, more intimate theatres and music halls also cropped up everywhere. While the West End was dripping in chandeliers, neighbourhoods across London sprouted their own modest venues. Some were converted pubs, others were former lecture halls or even old warehouses given a fresh coat of paint and a stage at one end. A few were so tiny that backstage was basically a broom closet, and orchestra pit was just a guy with a piano squeezed between the first row and the wall. Still, they counted. The architectural diversity was staggering. On one end you had theatres designed by Frank Matcham, the celebrated architect whose handiwork included ornate facades, sweeping staircases, and ceilings painted with cherubs that looked like they'd had too much mead. On the other, you had rough-and-ready halls where the most impressive feature was that the roof didn't leak, at least not on weekdays. Yet both ends of the spectrum played their role in feeding the insatiable appetite for live entertainment. What drove the building frenzy wasn't just London's appetite for spectacle, it was also demographics. The population was ballooning, with workers pouring in from the countryside and new suburbs forming on the city's fringes. Where people gathered, theatres followed. It was like Edwardian urban planning 101. If you've got houses, you'll soon need a grocer, a pub, and inevitably a theatre. And theatres weren't just multiplying in sheer number, they were multiplying in variety. Some specialized in musical comedy, others in melodrama, and still others in pantomime or serious plays. This diversification meant that almost anyone could find a show that suited their taste or their budget. Whether you wanted to sob dramatically into your handkerchief or laugh until you spilled your gin, there was a theatre for that. The rapid construction also turned London into a battleground for bragging rights. Owners and managers competed fiercely for audiences, splurging on decor and advertising like Edwardians on a sugar rush. Posters plastered the city with bold promises, the most dazzling production ever staged, or a comedy to end all comedies. Spoiler, comedy did not end. In many ways, the theatre boom was also a marketing boom. If your theatre didn't have the shiniest foyer or the biggest chorus line, you risked being forgotten in the shuffle. And of course, the boom wasn't without hiccups. Some theatres opened with great fanfare only to close within months when audiences lost interest. Others faced legal battles over safety because cramming hundreds of people into a building lit by early electrical systems wasn't always the wisest idea. A few even collapsed financially before the plaster had dried on their cherubs. But in the grand scheme, failure was a minor footnote. The overall trend was unstoppable. Londoners wanted more theatres, and builders delivered. For the everyday Londoner, the abundance of theatres meant choice like never before. You could stroll through the West End and take your pick. Lavish musical here, dramatic tragedy there, saucy music hall a few streets over. Theatre wasn't a rare treat anymore. It was becoming a routine part of urban life. Attending a show was as ordinary as buying a newspaper or cursing the weather. There's a humorous irony here. As the number of theatres multiplied, they began cannibalizing each other's audiences. One critic of the time joked that London's theatres are like children, too many, too loud, and constantly demanding attention. Yet instead of discouraging builders, the oversaturation only seemed to encourage them. It was as if theatre construction was contagious, and the only cure was more velvet seats. Theatres also reshaped the geography of entertainment. Streets that had once been sleepy or residential turned into buzzing nightlife hubs. Coffee houses, pubs and late-night eateries sprang up to serve theatre crowds. Suddenly, an entire economy revolved around the act of going to a show. Buying a theatre ticket didn't just mean 2 hours of entertainment. It meant an evening out, complete with dinner, drinks, gossip, and maybe a scandalous midnight cab ride home. So by the end of the Edwardian decade, London was a city bristling with theatres, grand, humble, and everything in between. It was a construction boom unlike anything the performing arts had ever seen, and it transformed the city's identity. Theatres became as much a part of London's fabric as its bridges, parks, and endless drizzle. Every spare street corner seemed to sprout a theatre faster than Victorians sprouted sideburns, and while some of those theatres didn't last, their sheer proliferation gave Edwardian London its distinctive energy, a city that never stopped building, never stopped performing, and never stopped selling tickets. If Edwardian London had a beating heart, it wasn't in Parliament, Buckingham Palace, or even at the racetrack where Edward VII indulged his love of horses. No, the pulse of the city throbbed loudest in the West End, where theatres stood shoulder to shoulder like jewels in a crown, glittering, buzzing, and occasionally smelling faintly of cigars and brandy. To walk down Shaftesbury Avenue or Drury Lane in 1905 was to stroll through the epicentre of Edwardian glamour, London's answer to Broadway, except with more fog and fewer hot dogs. The West End wasn't just a neighbourhood, it was a phenomenon. While smaller theatres cropped up all over London, some squeezed between pubs and warehouses, the West End was where the grandiose, glittering playhouses lived. Here, the city flexed its cultural muscles. If you wanted to impress your date, humiliate your rival, or simply remind your neighbours you were better than them, you bought tickets to a West End show. It wasn't about entertainment alone, it was about status. The West End was where you went to see and be seen. Shaftesbury Avenue in particular became the boulevard of dreams, built in the late Victorian period. By Edwardian times it had blossomed into a dazzling row of theatres, each one competing to outshine the other in architectural splendour. Think domed roofs, marble foyers, gilded cherubs grinning down from balconies, and chandeliers so big they looked like they'd crush a man flat if they sneezed too hard. If you walked past at night, the new electric signage blazed against the fog, beckoning like sirens to a crowd eager for laughter and spectacle. And then there was Drury Lane, practically a theatre kingdom unto itself. The Theatre Royal. Drury Lane wasn't just old, it was ancient by London standards, with a lineage stretching back centuries. By the Edwardian era, it had cemented itself as the palace of spectacle. Enormous productions with casts of hundreds filled its cavernous stage. Horses galloped across scenery, ships sailed on painted oceans, and elaborate stage machinery made whole castles rise and fall. If you wanted subtlety, you went elsewhere. If you wanted a set so massive it could probably be seen from space, had satellites been a thing, you went to Drury Lane. Inside these theatres, opulence ruled. Plush red velvet seats, ornate plasterwork, and walls painted in gold leaf gave audiences the illusion that they'd stepped into a palace rather than a public hall. The box seats offered aristocrats the perfect perch to watch both the stage and, more importantly, each other. Theatre was as much about fashion and display as it was about the play itself. For some Edwardians, missing the show didn't matter. Missing the opportunity to flaunt your diamonds under those blazing electric lights did. The West End also had its unique rhythm. Unlike the more casual music halls, the West End theatres operated on strict schedules. Evening shows began around 8, with matinees drawing daytime crowds of ladies, children, and those fortunate enough not to be chained to office desks. The air outside before a performance was electric, literally and figuratively. As carriages pulled up, motorcars honked their way through the streets, and ushers frantically directed queues of Londoners eager to secure the best seats. It was organised chaos with just enough champagne flowing to keep tempers in check. But beyond the glitz, the West End symbolised something deeper. It was the cultural centre of Edwardian London. Newspapers splashed theatre reviews across their pages, gossip columns obsessed over who attended which opening night, and caricatures of leading actors and actresses filled shop windows. A hit play could define a season, a flop could ruin reputations. The stakes were high, and the spotlight merciless. Yet that was part of the allure in the West End. Success and scandal walked hand in hand, arm in arm, occasionally tripping each other on the way out. Humorously enough, not all the glitter was gold. Behind the velvet curtains, West End theatres sometimes struggled with quirks that today would make health inspectors faint. Ventilation, for example, was hit or miss. One night a theatre might feel like an icebox, another like a sauna filled with perfume. Patrons often fainted, though it was hard to say whether it was from swooning at the drama, the heat, or the smell of the man next to them who hadn't met soap in several days. Yet people came back, again and again. That's the magic of the West End. You could sweat through your collar, but you'd still tell everyone it was the best evening of your life. The area also became a hub for after-show revelry. Restaurants, cafes, and late-night clubs mushroomed around the theatres, creating a nightlife ecosystem. Theatres pumped people into the streets, and those people weren't ready to go home. Supper parties stretched long into the night. Champagne corks popped, and critics scribbled their first impressions by candlelight. The West End was never just about the performance. It was about the ritual of the evening, the dinner, the play, the post-play gossip, and the stagger home under the glow of electric lamps. What made the West End unique was its dual identity. It was both elite and popular. Aristocrats in their private boxes rubbed elbows, metaphorically, not literally, God forbid, with clerks in the gallery who'd saved their shillings for weeks. It was one of the rare spaces where social classes shared the same room, if not the same view. From the gods up high to the stalls below, everyone laughed at the same jokes, though some laughed more politely than others. By 1910, the West End had become so synonymous with glamour and theatre that it practically defined Edwardian London's cultural life. To say you'd been to Shaftesbury Avenue or Drury Lane was shorthand for sophistication, and for those who couldn't afford tickets, simply standing outside the glittering facades and soaking up the glow of electric lights was entertainment enough. The West End was more than a cluster of theatres. It was a universe of velvet, smoke, light and spectacle. It was where plays became legends, where society played out its own drama in the audience, and where London showed off its cultural heartbeat. It was, quite simply, the glittering heart of Edwardian theatre, London's Broadway, except with more fog and fewer hot dogs. If the West End was the glittering heart of Edwardian theatre, then the middle class was the blood pumping through it. Before this era, theatre had been something of a gated playground for the wealthy, and titled the kind of place where powdered aristocrats in private boxes whispered more about each other than about the play. But Edwardian London cracked that exclusivity wide open. Suddenly, clerks, typists, shopgirls, and even cash-strapped students found themselves slipping into velvet seats, clutching a program, and pretending they understood iambic pentameter. The revolution wasn't born out of generosity but economics. Managers and investors realized that relying solely on the aristocracy wasn't sustainable. The rich liked theatre, but they also liked going on holiday, attending endless dinner parties, or occasionally just being rich in the countryside. The middle classes, however, lived in the city year-round, worked predictable hours, and most importantly, were desperate for affordable escapes from the monotony of ledgers, typewriters, and endless cups of lukewarm tea. Theatre owners smelled opportunity, and perhaps the faint scent of coal smoke still clinging to these new patrons, and adjusted prices accordingly. Enter the gallery seats, affectionately known as the gods, perched high above the stage. They offered the cheapest way into the magical world of theatre. The view was often less than ideal. You might see more of the ceiling than the actors, but it didn't matter. For the price of a pint and a questionable meat pie, you too could see Shakespeare mangled on stage, and even if Hamlet's famous to be or not to be soliloquy sounded more like to wheeze or not to wheeze from your altitude, the thrill of being there was intoxicating. It wasn't just the galleries that catered to the middle class. Some theatres created special matinees with lower prices, perfect for shopgirls on their afternoon off, or students willing to skip lectures for something far more entertaining than economics. Discounted seats at the back of the stalls or along the sides allowed clerks and teachers to brush elbows, literally, due to cramped seating with wealthier patrons. This mingling of classes inside the theatre created a rare democratic moment in Edwardian society. Outside, rigid social boundaries ruled. Inside, everyone was united in laughing at the same pratfall or gasping at the same dramatic death scene, and what an audience they were. Middle-class theatre-goers brought an energy that was very different from their aristocratic counterparts. The wealthy tended to treat theatre as another social engagement, an excuse to show off diamonds or critique the costumes. The middle classes, however, came for the thrill of it. They leaned forward in their seats, reacted audibly to shocking plot twists, and clapped with abandon at the end of songs. If the upper classes were there to be seen, the middle classes were there to feel. This new audience also transformed what got staged. Managers realized that moralizing Victorian melodramas weren't exactly what the clerk who just spent 10 hours copying numbers into a ledger wanted to see. Instead, theatres leaned into lighter fare, musical comedies, sparkling wit, and shows that left you humming on the way home. Did these plays always make sense? Absolutely not. But middle-class audiences didn't mind if the plot was thinner than a tea biscuit. So long as the tunes were catchy and the chorus line dazzling, it was worth the ticket. Students, in particular, added their own flavour to Edwardian audiences. They often scraped together pennies for cheap seats and brought with them a youthful enthusiasm and occasionally rowdiness that both delighted and infuriated theatre managers. Their cheers and jeers could make or break a performance. Actors learned quickly that if you didn't win over the students in the gallery, you were in for a long night. Think of them as the Edwardian version of social media critics. Loud, unforgiving, and very public. Shopgirls were another vital demographic. For many young women working long hours in London's expanding retail sector, the theatre offered a rare taste of glamour and freedom. The chorus girls on stage, with their fashionable costumes and confident dance routines, were aspirational figures. Watching them strut under the limelight was like glimpsing a parallel universe where ordinary girls could become stars. Of course, not everyone approved. Moralists fretted that theatres encouraged improper ideas among young women, but if improper meant dreaming of something beyond folding handkerchiefs in a department store, then improper was exactly what they needed. Clerks and office workers, meanwhile, embraced the theatre as a well-earned reward. Their days were filled with endless paperwork, bosses breathing down their necks, and ink stains that never seemed to wash out. For them, the theatre was liberation, a chance to laugh, cry, or cheer without worrying about tomorrow's deadlines. And while they might not afford the best seats, they had something the aristocracy often lacked: unfiltered joy. They didn't come to judge the costumes, they came to live for 2 hours in a brighter world. This democratization of theatre also sparked debates. Critics worried that catering to the middle classes meant dumbing down productions. They wrung their hands at the rise of frivolous comedies and cheeky songs, fearing Shakespeare's legacy was being drowned in cheap laughs. Yet the reality was more complex. The influx of middle-class audiences kept theatres financially afloat, funded new productions, and created a broader cultural appetite that ensured theatre remained central to Edwardian life. In short, without the clerks, shopgirls, and students, the Grand West End would have been a lot quieter. So the next time you imagine Edwardian London, don't just picture aristocrats in opera cloaks descending from carriages. Picture the clerk sprinting from the office, the shopgirl sneaking in with a friend, or the student scraping together change. They filled the galleries, the cheap seats, and sometimes even the stalls, transforming the theatre from an elite pastime into a mass cultural obsession. For the price of a pint and a questionable meat pie, you too could see Shakespeare mangled on stage. And for millions of Edwardians, that was a bargain worth every shilling. In Edwardian London, the theatre wasn't run by faceless committees or distant investors. It was ruled by flamboyant monarchs of their own little kingdoms, the actor-managers. These were men, and occasionally women, who not only performed on stage but also directed, produced, and controlled the finances of their theatres. In short, they were bosses and stars rolled into one. Imagine being your own employer and your own favorite employee. Talk about employee of the month, every month. The most famous of these theatrical emperors was Herbert Beerbohm Tree, a man whose name alone sounded like it had been invented for the stage. Tree managed Her Majesty's Theatre in Haymarket, where he became legendary for his elaborate Shakespeare productions. He was the kind of manager who spared no expense, and occasionally no logic in his quest for spectacle. If Shakespeare called for a forest, Tree planted a forest. If Shakespeare mentioned a shipwreck, Tree brought in a ship. His productions had more scenery than some countries had infrastructure. Tree wasn't just about excess, he was also a skilled performer, known for his powerful voice and commanding stage presence. Yet even his acting was often overshadowed by the sheer scale of his productions. In one staging of A Midsummer Night's Dream, he included live rabbits on stage to give the forest authenticity. Unsurprisingly, the rabbits refused to follow stage directions and spent most of the performance nibbling the scenery. But that was the point. Under an actor-manager, the show was as much about personal vision, or ego, as about the script. And Tree was hardly alone. The Edwardian era was crawling with actor-managers who ruled their theatres like small kingdoms. George Alexander at the St. James's Theatre became famous for his polished productions and for premiering new works, including Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest. A few years before Edward VII took the throne, Alexander combined impeccable taste with a businessman's eye, knowing that a strong box office mattered just as much as strong performances. Then there was Charles Wyndham, who managed the Criterion Theatre and later Wyndham's Theatre. Yes, he was successful enough to get one named after himself. Wyndham was known for his suave presence and knack for comedy, and his theatres catered to audiences who wanted charm and wit, delivered with a side of elegance. Being an actor-manager wasn't just about acting skill, it was about branding. Long before marketing gurus coined the word. What made these figures so powerful? was their ability to shape every aspect of a production. Unlike modern actors who take direction from others, the actor-manager had the final word on everything from casting to costumes to whether the curtains should be velvet or silk. If they wanted a play rewritten, it was rewritten. If they decided a minor role should suddenly expand conveniently for themselves, so be it. They were directors, producers, HR managers, and sometimes interior decorators. Theatres reflected their personalities, and audiences often came as much for the star behind the show as for the play itself. Of course, such power bred eccentricity. Actor-managers were notorious for their egos, and stories abound of their quirks. One was said to demand that his dressing room always contain a bouquet of white roses because red roses clashed with his complexion. Another insisted on rewriting Shakespeare's lines to give himself more heroic speeches, regardless of whether Shakespeare had intended them or not. If Hamlet seemed unusually chatty in an Edwardian production, you could probably thank an actor-manager boosting his role. The system had practical advantages too. Having the manager on stage meant there was always a guaranteed draw. Audiences knew they'd see a star. It also gave stability to theatres, since a successful actor-manager could run a venue for decades. But it was a risky business. If the star manager aged poorly, audiences noticed. Nothing tested suspension of disbelief quite like watching a 50-year-old Romeo sighing over a Juliet young enough to be his granddaughter. Still, vanity rarely got in the way. If you owned the theatre, who was going to tell you no? The cult of the actor-manager also created fierce rivalries. Each ran their theatre like a fiefdom, and competition was intense. Managers poached actors from each other, battled for the best playwrights, and tried to outdo one another with ever more extravagant productions. It was theatrical warfare with velvet curtains instead of cannons. Newspapers fueled the rivalries, reporting on opening nights like they were gladiatorial contests. "Tree triumphs," might scream one headline, only to be followed a week later by "Alexander steals the season." Audiences lapped it up, enjoying the drama off stage almost as much as the plays themselves. What's remarkable is how much personal charisma defined the Edwardian stage through these actor-managers. They weren't just entertainers, they were tastemakers, celebrities and businessmen rolled into one. Their faces were on posters, their names in lights, and their reputations inseparable from the theatres they ran. To say you'd been to Tree's Her Majesty's or Alexander's St. James's was shorthand for quality, or at least for spectacle. And while the system might sound outdated today, in Edwardian London it was the engine that drove theatrical culture. The actor-manager gave audiences stability, theatres vision, and journalists endless gossip. Their reign would eventually fade as theatre management became more corporate in the 20th century. But for a golden Edwardian decade or two, the stage belonged to these larger-than-life figures. So imagine being your own boss and your own star employee, rewriting Shakespeare when you felt like it, surrounding yourself with bouquets of flattering flowers, and giving yourself the juiciest lines. That was the life of the Edwardian actor-manager employee of the month, every month, until the curtain finally fell. If Edwardian London had a soundtrack, it would have been a musical comedy tune, jaunty, catchy, and slightly cheeky. The kind of thing you couldn't shake out of your head even if you begged. These shows didn't ask you to think deeply about life, death, or the fate of nations. They asked you to laugh, tap your foot, and forget your troubles for a few hours. In an era where the world was getting louder, faster, and more complicated, Edwardian musical comedy was simple, light as a feather, sparkling as champagne, and every bit as addictive. At the center of this theatrical sugar rush was George Edwards, the impresario who perfected the formula. Managing the Gaiety theatre, Edwards realized that audiences weren't always in the mood for the heavy melodramas and grand operas of the past. They wanted something fun, flirtatious, and modern, so he gave them exactly that. His shows were the theatrical equivalent of a fizzy drink. Not much nutritional value, but oh, how refreshing. Edwards specialized in musical comedies, and the term was deliberate. These weren't serious operettas, nor were they bawdy music hall revues. Instead, they struck a balance between sophistication and silliness, combining witty dialogue, hummable songs, and glamorous chorus lines. The stories were often frivolous to the point of absurdity. A typical plot might involve a love triangle, a case of mistaken identity, and at least one eccentric foreigner who existed mainly to wear a funny hat. Subtle? Hardly. Entertaining? Absolutely. The humor of these productions was breezy and modern, reflecting a new Edwardian appetite for cheekiness. Characters flirted openly, chorus girls winked knowingly at the audience, and comic asides broke the fourth wall. For Londoners who had endured decades of Victorian morality plays, this was a revelation. These shows weren't sermons with costumes, they were invitations to laugh at life. And if the jokes occasionally veered into the ridiculous, well, that was the point. The music was just as crucial. Composers wrote numbers designed to linger in the ear long after the final curtain. Audiences would hum them on the tram ride home, sing them in the office the next day, and drive their neighbors insane by whistling the same chorus for weeks. The plots may have been thinner than Edwardian soup, but the tunes stuck in your head like glue. That was their secret weapon. You didn't need to remember the details of the story because you were too busy remembering the melody. One of the most iconic features of these shows was the chorus line. The Gaiety girls, as Edwards called them. Dressed in fashionable costumes, they embodied Edwardian ideals of beauty, elegance, and just a touch of daring independence. They weren't scandalous like music hall performers, but they weren't prim either. They danced, they smiled, and they set fashion trends off the stage as well as on it. For young women in the audience, the Gaiety girls represented possibility, modern, stylish, and admired by society. For men in the audience, well, let's just say they provided plenty of incentive to buy tickets. The staging of musical comedies was a spectacle in itself. Sets were bright and lavish, costumes shimmered with sequins, and scene changes happened with clockwork precision. These weren't productions designed to evoke awe or fear. They were designed to dazzle. Everything sparkled just enough to keep the mood buoyant. When in doubt, add more feathers, more sequins, and another comic dance number. Critics, naturally, sometimes sneered at the genre. They complained that musical comedies lacked depth, that they were shallow froth designed for people with short attention spans. And to be fair, they weren't entirely wrong, but audiences didn't care. After a long day of work, people weren't clamoring for existential tragedy. They wanted a catchy song and a good laugh. Edwards himself reportedly said that his shows gave people something pleasant to hum and something pretty to look at. Mission accomplished. These productions also had a social edge, however subtle. They poked fun at aristocrats, mocked foreign stereotypes, and highlighted the quirks of modern urban life. The jokes may have been wrapped in sparkle, but they carried a sly awareness of Edwardian society's absurdities. You could laugh at the foolish nobleman on stage while secretly recognizing the foolish nobleman you saw strutting down Piccadilly earlier that day. Musical comedy became so popular that it influenced fashion, speech, and even behavior. Women copied the hairstyles of chorus girls, while men adopted slang picked up from comic characters. Songs leapt from the stage into drawing rooms and pubs, becoming part of everyday conversation. The shows weren't just entertainment, they were cultural glue, binding together audiences who wanted to share a laugh in a city that could often feel overwhelming. By the mid-Edwardian period, musical comedy was the dominant theatrical genre in London. Opera still had its elite patrons, Shakespeare still had his champions, but for sheer popularity, nothing matched the Gaiety-style show. They defined an era of theatre that was unapologetically fun, full of glamour, and always ready with a punchline or a patter song. So, when you think of Edwardian theatre, don't picture somber tragedians declaiming under heavy velvet curtains. Picture instead a stage bursting with sequins, a chorus line kicking in perfect unison, and an audience laughing until their cheeks ached. The Edwardian musical comedy didn't just entertain, it sparkled. The plots may have been thinner than Edwardian soup, but the tunes stuck in your head like glue, and in the end that was exactly what people wanted. Not depth, not moral lessons, but an evening of light, dazzling delight. If Edwardian London had one seasonal obsession bigger than mince pies or questionable eggnog, it was the Christmas pantomime. Every December, theatres across the city erupted into organised chaos, as audiences flocked to see men in wigs, women in trousers, and children shrieking at the top of their lungs. Nothing says holiday spirit like watching a grown man in a wig scream at children to yell "He's behind you," while a villain in eyeliner hisses dramatically. Pantomime wasn't new to Edwardian London. It had roots going back to the 18th century, but in the early 1900s it became a cultural juggernaut. By then it had morphed into a uniquely British blend of fairy tale, slapstick comedy, musical numbers, and audience participation. It was theatre turned into a carnival, performed indoors and wrapped in tinsel. Families treated pantomime as a sacred tradition, as important as hanging stockings or pretending to enjoy Aunt Mildred's pudding. The plots, if you could call them that, were loosely based on familiar fairy tales, but once the curtain rose, fidelity to the story became optional. A pantomime script was more like a polite suggestion. Characters routinely broke the fourth wall, songs interrupted the narrative, and local jokes crept in at every opportunity. Imagine Cinderella stopping halfway through to make jokes about London fog or the rising price of bread, and you've got the idea. The centerpiece of pantomime was the panto dame, a flamboyant female character played by a man in increasingly outrageous costumes. These dames were comic tornadoes, loud, exaggerated, and impossible to ignore. They mugged to the audience, cracked bawdy jokes that sailed over the heads of children but made parents choke on their gin, and treated subtlety as an alien concept. Picture a man with painted cheeks, a towering wig, and a dress the size of a small marquee, bellowing, "Ooh, you naughty lot," and you're halfway there. Equally vital was the principal boy, a role traditionally played by a young woman in tights, strutting about heroically with one leg always angled, just so to display her shapely calves. This bit of casting ensured that fathers in the audience were mysteriously eager to attend the panto every year, even when they groaned about silly nonsense in public. Between the dames, the boys, and the villains twirling mustaches, pantomime delivered something for everyone, from giggling children to scandalized grandparents. Audience participation was the lifeblood of the pantomime. Unlike the hushed reverence of Shakespearean productions, pantomime encouraged noise, heckling, and gleeful chaos. Children were expected to shout, "He's behind you," whenever the villain crept up, while adults joined in the singing and booed or cheered with equal enthusiasm. For once, social etiquette so strict in Edwardian daily life was gleefully abandoned. You could shout at actors without being tossed out. In fact, you were supposed to. It was the one time a London crowd could be rowdy indoors and not get arrested. The staging was as gaudy as possible. Sets overflowed with glitter and bright colours, transforming the theatre into a festive dreamscape. Trapdoors and mechanical effects brought giants, fairies, and animals to life. Horses pulled carriages across the stage. Transformations happened in bursts of smoke, and occasionally things went hilariously wrong. One year, an Edwardian Jack and the Beanstalk staged its famous giant with an enormous papier-mâché puppet. Midway through, the head fell off, rolled into the orchestra pit, and startled the violinist so badly he bolted. The audience loved it. The chaos wasn't a bug, it was a feature. Pantomimes also doubled as showcases for popular songs and local humor. Well-known tunes were shoehorned into the script, giving audiences a chance to sing along. Jokes were updated every year to reference current events, politicians, and scandals, making pantomime feel both timeless and topical. You might go to see Aladdin, but you'd leave with jokes about Edwardian traffic jams or the latest misadventures of Parliament. It was tradition dressed in sequins, always updated just enough to stay fresh. For families, pantomime was more than entertainment, it was ritual. Children begged their parents for tickets months in advance, and theatres marketed panto as wholesome, all-ages fun. Well, as wholesome as it could be with a man in drag making jokes about sausages. It was often a child's first exposure to theatre, planting the seed of lifelong theatrical enthusiasm. More importantly, it was one of the few times Edwardians of all classes could sit side by side in the same room, united in laughter and shouting. Of course, not everyone was a fan. Highbrow critics sniffed that pantomimes were gaudy, vulgar, and lacking artistic merit. They wrung their hands about the decline of taste and feared that panto was corrupting young minds, but the public ignored them. Year after year, theatres sold out, laughter echoed through the streets, and panto cemented its role as the season's biggest event. For every critic who moaned about falling standards, there were hundreds of families howling with joy as Cinderella's carriage transformed before their eyes. In Edwardian London, the pantomime craze proved that theatre didn't have to be serious to matter. It was silly, loud, and often ridiculous, but it was also communal, joyous, and utterly unforgettable. More than just a show, it was a celebration, binding families and communities together in a shared annual ritual. So as the curtain rose on yet another glittering pantomime, audiences braced for pratfalls, outrageous dames, and a chorus of children shrieking at villains. Nothing says holiday spirit like watching a grown man in a wig scream at children to yell, "He's behind you," and nothing said Edwardian Christmas quite like the glorious nonsense of pantomime. By the Edwardian era, theatre wasn't just a playground for dandies, businessmen, or chorus girl admirers. It had also become a battlefield, at least when women were involved. The Edwardian theatre craze coincided with the height of the women's suffrage movement, and nowhere did the cultural and political clash show more vividly than inside London's playhouses. Some women went for laughs, others chained themselves to seats. Either way, the show went on. Let's start with women as the audience. For much of the 19th century, respectable women were often discouraged from attending theatre unaccompanied. A lone lady in a music hall was assumed to be working, and not in the clerical sense. But Edwardian theatres, particularly the more refined West End houses, offered a safer, more socially acceptable environment. Suddenly, clerks' daughters, typists, and middle-class matrons could flock to matinees in groups, enjoying the spectacle without fear of scandal. The theatre became a rare public space where women could gather openly, chat freely, and express delight or disgust without worrying too much about the watchful eyes of society. Matinees, in particular, were practically designed for women. Scheduled in the afternoons, they catered to shopgirls with a half-day off, mothers looking for respectable entertainment, and students hoping to sneak a break from lectures. The sight of rows of feathered hats bobbing in the stalls was a common one. The theatre wasn't just a place to watch a show, it was a social arena. Women sized up fashion trends, gossiped about actresses, and took notes on the Gaiety girls' dresses, as if studying for an exam in modern glamour. On stage, women were more visible than ever before. Actresses like Lily Elsie, Gladys Cooper, and Marie Tempest became stars. Their faces splashed across postcards, magazines, and advertising posters. They weren't just entertainers, they were icons of Edwardian femininity. A young woman could sit in the gallery, look down at Elsie gliding across the stage, and think, why shouldn't I live like that? The actresses embodied a new model of independence, fashionable, glamorous, and financially successful in a society where most women were still expected to depend on husbands or fathers. But the most disruptive female presence in Edwardian theatres wasn't in the audience or on the stage. It was in the suffragette protests that turned theatres into political arenas. The Women's Social and Political Union WSPU, led by Emmeline Pankhurst, was famous for its militant tactics, marches, window smashing, hunger strikes, and yes, theatre disruptions. For suffragettes, theatres were perfect targets. They drew large, respectable crowds, included members of the political and social elite, and crucially, had press reporters in attendance. If you wanted your message noticed, why not interrupt Hamlet with a demand for votes for women? The tactics varied. Some suffragettes handed out leaflets in the lobbies, hoping to convert sympathetic playgoers. Others shouted slogans mid-performance, timing their cries for maximum dramatic effect. The truly bold chained themselves to theatre seats, forcing ushers and police to clatter through rows of horrified patrons with saws and bolt cutters. One can imagine the scene, an Edwardian couple whispering about the costumes, only to have the lady in front of them suddenly handcuff herself to the chair and begin shouting, "Votes for women." It wasn't exactly subtle, but it was certainly memorable. Needless to say, reactions were mixed. Some audiences booed the interruptions, furious that their evening of entertainment had been hijacked. Others applauded or joined in, delighted to see drama both on and off the stage. Managers fumed at the disruptions, but newspapers lapped them up. Headlines the next morning gleefully reported on the suffragette who stole the spotlight from Shakespeare, or the protest that nearly stopped the curtain call. For the suffragettes, every angry boo or shocked gasp was proof their message had landed. It wasn't only about disruption, though. The theatre also became a symbolic battleground in the wider cultural debate over women's roles. Plays featuring independent heroines, witty female characters, or unconventional romances struck a chord with audiences living in a society where women were pushing against the boundaries of tradition. Suffragettes themselves often pointed to the irony. Audiences could cheer a fictional woman for defying odds on stage but still resist granting real women the right to vote outside the theatre. There's also a delicious humour in imagining how these disruptions played out. Picture Herbert Beerbohm Tree delivering Shakespeare with sonorous dignity, only to be drowned out by a chorus of suffragettes demanding political equality. Or imagine a pantomime dame pausing mid-gag to glare at the commotion while the audience debated whether this was part of the show. Edwardian theatregoers loved spectacle, and the suffragettes gave it to them, albeit unintentionally. For the women who weren't chaining themselves to chairs, simply being present in the theatre carried its own quiet defiance. The Edwardian era was still rigid about a woman's place, yet thousands of women made the theatre their place. They chose what to see, when to see it, and how to respond. The applause, the laughter, the boos, all were acts of expression, tiny rehearsals for the larger performance of demanding social change. In this sense, the suffragettes in the stalls weren't an intrusion into theatre culture. They were a reflection of it. The Edwardian stage thrived on energy, unpredictability and drama, and the suffragettes brought all three in spades. Whether they came to admire Lily Elsie's gowns, to laugh at a pantomime dame, or to make their voices heard over Shakespeare himself, women were no longer silent spectators in Edwardian theatres. Some went for laughs, others chained themselves to seats. Either way, the show went on. And in the process, Edwardian theatre became not just a site of entertainment, but a stage for one of the most important social struggles of the age. Not everyone in Edwardian London could afford a ticket to the West End's velvet-draped theatres, nor did everyone particularly want to sit through another musical comedy about aristocrats who fell in love between tea breaks. And for the working classes, the true heart of entertainment beat not in Shaftesbury Avenue, but in the city's music halls and vaudeville stages. Here the air smelled of beer, the jokes were bawdy, and the songs were catchy enough to follow you all the way back to your crowded tenement flat. If you couldn't afford the West End, you could still laugh at jokes that were older than your landlord. Music halls had existed since the mid-19th century, evolving from saloon singing rooms attached to pubs. By the Edwardian era, they were at their height, rowdy, bustling, and often packed to bursting. The entertainment was variety at its purest, a dizzying parade of acts, each more absurd than the last. One minute you were watching a singer warble sentimental ballads about lost love. The next, a comic in oversized trousers was tripping over his own feet to delighted howls. If you got lucky, an acrobat might dangle from the ceiling, or a ventriloquist would introduce his wooden friend with a smile that unsettled everyone in the first 3 rows. Unlike the polished precision of the West End, music halls thrived on chaos. The program was less a carefully curated sequence and more a carnival buffet. Didn't like the comedian? No problem. Another act would be on stage in 5 minutes. Audiences weren't there to be impressed by sophistication. They were there to drink, laugh, and forget the smog, the rent, and their bosses. The atmosphere was as much a part of the experience as the performers. Picture long wooden tables, pints of beer sloshing as men in shirt sleeves banged their mugs in time with the music. Women, yes, women of all classes attended too, often in groups, enjoying the freedom to shout, laugh, and sing along without worrying about ladylike behavior. In the music hall, etiquette was left at the door. If you wanted to heckle, heckle. If you wanted to sing louder than the performer, go right ahead. If you wanted to stand up and dance in the aisles, well, no one was stopping you. The songs themselves were legends of their day, catchy, witty, and often cheeky. They could be sentimental one moment and scandalous the next. Some celebrated working-class life with choruses about factory shifts, market stalls, or the joys of payday. Others were comic ditties full of double entendres, delighting audiences who relished the thrill of jokes that tiptoed or stomped on the edge of decency. Think of it as the Edwardian version of stand-up comedy mixed with karaoke, except the beer was cheaper and the pianos more out of tune. Vaudeville acts added extra spice to the mix. Jugglers, magicians, strongmen and animal trainers all took their turn in the spotlight. A trained dog walking on two legs might follow an opera singer, while a contortionist folded themselves into a box right before a sketch comedy troupe stormed on stage. The sheer variety was part of the charm. You never knew what was coming next, which meant you never got bored, or at least not for long. Of course, the humor wasn't always subtle. Slapstick reigned supreme. Comedians leaned into pratfalls, pies in the face, and trousers that never quite fit. Audiences loved seeing authority figures mocked. Pompous professors, bumbling policemen, or landlords lampooned until the house roared with laughter. In a society where many workers lived under strict rules and crushing hierarchies, mocking authority in song and sketch was a delicious kind of revenge. The music halls also had their stars. Marie Lloyd, for example, was the undisputed queen of the halls, famous for her saucy songs and suggestive winks that managed to scandalize critics while sending audiences into fits of laughter. Lloyd could take a line as innocent as "She sits among the cabbages and peas" and wring enough innuendo out of it to bring the house down. She represented everything the halls stood for: irreverence, cheek, and the thrill of a joke shared between performer and audience. Yet despite the bawdiness, music halls weren't just dens of vice. They were vital social spaces, offering working-class communities a place to gather, relax, and see their own lives reflected in humor and song. Where the West End often paraded aristocrats and their trivial romances, the music hall celebrated milkmen, factory girls, and market traders. Audiences laughed at themselves and their world, and in doing so claimed a cultural space of their own. Critics, naturally, tried to dismiss the halls as vulgar or corrupting. There were endless hand-wringing debates about whether a comic song might lead to the downfall of civilization, or whether a suggestive dance might undo the morals of the nation. But the halls endured, because for the people who filled them night after night, they weren't just entertainment, they were relief. There's something almost revolutionary about it. In the music hall, the audience was king. If you bored them, they booed you off. If you delighted them, they sang with you until the walls shook. Performers lived or died by the crowd's mood, and audiences loved the power. It was messy, it was loud, it was gloriously democratic. So while the West End may have dazzled with chandeliers and velvet curtains, the real laughter often echoed from the music halls, a chorus of working-class voices singing songs that critics hated but people loved. Vaudeville and music halls were the rougher, rowdier cousins of Edwardian theatre, and they proved that you didn't need marble foyers to put on a good show. If you couldn't afford the West End, you could still laugh at jokes that were older than your landlord, and odds are they'd still be funny the next night too. If Edwardian London had celebrities brighter than its electric marquees, they were the Gaiety girls. More than chorus line dancers, they were cultural icons, fashion plates, tabloid fodder, and aspirational figures for a generation of women itching for independence. They had more sparkle than Edwardian chandeliers and caused more gossip than royal mistresses. The Gaiety girls were the creation of George Edwards, the impresario who had already revolutionized Edwardian musical comedy. At the Gaiety Theatre, he assembled chorus lines not of bawdy music hall performers or over-the-top burlesque dancers, but of young women chosen for their elegance, beauty, and charm. They were stylish, poised, and carefully marketed as respectable, a term stretched just enough to let men fantasize while mothers allowed their daughters to watch. What set the Gaiety girls apart was their image. They weren't painted as scandalous vamps or tragic heroines. They were modern, fashionable women who looked like they might step out of the theatre and into your drawing room. They wore the latest gowns, carried themselves with dignity when they weren't high-kicking in perfect unison, and became walking advertisements for Edwardian chic. Designers scrambled to dress them, and photographs of the girls appeared in shop windows and magazines across London. If you wanted to know what hat was in style or how hemlines were creeping up, scandalously by about 3 inches, you only had to glance at the Gaiety chorus, and London society noticed. Wealthy men, titled lords, industrial tycoons and politicians with more champagne than sense, began courting the Gaiety girls. Newspapers gleefully reported every flirtation, engagement or broken romance, often in more detail than they reported Parliament debates. The idea of a chorus girl marrying into high society became a running joke, and sometimes a reality. A few Gaiety girls married into aristocracy, scandalizing traditionalists who clutched their pearls at the thought of a duke's bride, once having worn sequins on stage. But the Gaiety girls were more than tabloid trophies. They embodied a new model of womanhood, one that hinted at independence and possibility. Unlike many of their peers, they earned wages, often supported themselves in the city, and carved out identities beyond the domestic sphere. For young women in the audience, especially shopgirls or clerks, they represented an intoxicating what if. What if you could live in fashionable gowns, perform under glittering lights, and be admired by thousands? The theatre became both a fantasy and, for a lucky few, a career ladder. Of course, the independence came with a heavy dose of risk. The Edwardian public loved to glamorize the Gaiety girls, but it also scrutinized them relentlessly. Respectability was a precarious balance. Too much flirtation with wealthy admirers, and a chorus girl might be labeled immoral. Too little sparkle, and she risked being overlooked entirely. The press adored turning their lives into soap operas, and a single rumor could make or break reputations. One review summed it up perfectly. They are admired, envied, courted and condemned, all in the same breath. Still, their power couldn't be denied. The Gaiety girls influenced not only fashion, but also social attitudes. They normalized the idea of women being visible, admired, and unapologetically modern. Unlike the suffragettes shouting in theatres for votes, the Gaiety girls staged a quieter rebellion, proving that women could live independently, be cultural tastemakers, and move in circles previously closed to them. While critics dismissed them as shallow, their cultural footprint was enormous. On stage, their performances were precision-engineered to dazzle, perfectly synchronized dances, coy smiles at the audience, and just enough costume glitter to make the electric lights bounce off their sequins like stars. Their routines weren't designed to challenge minds, they were designed to enchant, and enchant they did. Audiences returned again and again, not necessarily for the play, but to see the girls. Some patrons couldn't even hum the songs afterward, but they remembered the chorus line shimmering in their minds for days. Behind the glamour, life for the Gaiety girls was demanding. Rehearsals were grueling, expectations high, and wages often modest compared to the wealth they generated for theatres. They had to maintain appearances both on and off stage, balancing flirtation with discretion, popularity with propriety. Many lived in shared lodgings, navigating the city's dangers and delights with the resilience of young women determined to make their mark. The fantasy of champagne dinners with lords existed for a lucky few. For most, it was long hours of practice, strict stage managers, and the occasional wardrobe malfunction with 1,000 eyes watching. Still, the cultural myth of the Gaiety girl outshone the reality. She wasn't just a chorus dancer. She was the Edwardian equivalent of a movie star, fashion model, and influencer rolled into one. Her face sold magazines, her style set trends, and her romances filled gossip columns. Men wanted them, women wanted to be them, and society couldn't stop talking about them. So when Edwardian London glittered, it wasn't just chandeliers or gilded balconies. It was the sparkle of the Gaiety girls, strutting across the stage with elegance, confidence, and just enough cheek to drive audiences wild. They had more sparkle than Edwardian chandeliers and caused more gossip than royal mistresses, and that, more than anything, is why they remain icons of their age. If there was one thing Edwardian audiences loved almost as much as a catchy tune, It was a good spectacle, and by good, they meant massive, glittering, and preferably so over the top that you half expected the ceiling to collapse under the weight of sequins. The Edwardian theatre wasn't just about actors saying lines, it was about transporting audiences into other worlds with costumes, sets, and illusions so dazzling that for a few hours you could forget London fog and imagine you were in fairyland or ancient Egypt. One minute you were in Cleopatra's court, the next you were inside a magical forest. Talk about cheaper than a vacation. The craze for spectacle was fueled by both competition and technology. With so many theatres vying for audiences, managers looked for ways to outdo each other. If one theatre unveiled a glittering Roman forum on stage, the next week another theatre would boast a functioning waterfall. Frank Matcham's theatre designs, with their enormous stages, fly towers, and hidden machinery, made such ambitions possible. Suddenly, producers could build sets that moved, transformed, and practically breathed. Why just paint a ship when you could make it sway across the stage with mechanical rigging? Why just suggest a forest when you could plant dozens of potted trees and hope the rabbits didn't chew them again? Costumes were equally ambitious. Historical dramas demanded authenticity, or at least what Edwardians thought looked authentic. A play set in medieval times might feature gowns so encrusted with jewels that actresses complained of backaches, while Egyptian productions sent performers strutting across the stage in gold headdresses, revealing just enough flesh to make audiences blush and critics sputter. Accuracy was negotiable. Spectacle was mandatory. In many cases, the costumes told the story better than the script. Who needed character development when you could show up in a 10-foot cape that required 2 assistants to carry? Special effects became their own form of magic. Trapdoors allowed villains to vanish in clouds of smoke. Mechanical lifts sent goddesses descending from the heavens, though occasionally they stopped halfway, leaving the actress dangling in front of the audience like a disgruntled chandelier. Mirrors and lighting tricks created illusions of ghosts, storms, or armies marching into infinity. Pyrotechnics provided thunder, lightning, and sometimes unintentionally singed eyebrows. Theatre wasn't a passive experience, it was a roller coaster of surprises, where part of the thrill came from not knowing whether the next illusion would succeed or hilariously fail. Producers leaned heavily on scene changes as moments of pure theatrical wonder. Between acts, stage crews worked furiously behind the curtain, readying an entirely new world. When the curtain rose, audiences gasped at the sudden shift from palace to battlefield, or from enchanted wood to glittering ballroom. Some shows became famous less for their stories than for their sets. In fact, critics joked that in certain productions, the scenery deserved top billing, with the actors reduced to mere decoration. Imagine working on your Hamlet only to be upstaged by a mechanical windmill. Humbling, to say the least. One of the most ambitious spectacles of the period was Herbert Beerbohm Tree's productions at Her Majesty's Theatre. In his staging of Henry VIII, he filled the stage with enormous Tudor banquets, complete with real food and wine. The actors dined so heartily that some supposedly left the theatre tipsier than when they entered. In The Tempest, Tree brought live birds onto the stage for atmosphere, only to discover that birds, much like rabbits, are notoriously unwilling to follow stage directions. Audiences loved it. It didn't matter if the animals wandered into the orchestra pit, it just made the whole thing feel even more magical. Of course, the appetite for spectacle sometimes bordered on absurd. In one production of Ben-Hur, a full-scale chariot race was recreated on stage with live horses galloping on a treadmill-like contraption. It was jaw-dropping, chaotic, and wildly impractical, but audiences adored it. Who cared if the dialogue was wooden? There were horses on stage. For Edwardians, the thrill of seeing the impossible made possible was worth every penny. Even comedies leaned on costumes and illusions to boost their charm. A flimsy farce could be elevated by elaborate disguises, quick-change outfits, or a set with a dozen doors for perfectly timed entrances and exits. The humor was often amplified by the staging. A collapsing staircase, a spinning bed, or an exploding teapot could bring the house down more effectively than any punchline. Audiences fed on this kind of theatrical magic. In daily life, London was noisy, dirty, and relentlessly grey. Inside the theatre, however, you could be swept into a world of colour, grandeur, and wonder. It was escapism at its finest. No need to book a holiday to Cairo or Athens when you could see Egypt and Greece recreated in glorious technicolor. Well, technicolor in Edwardian terms, which meant a lot of painted canvas and imaginative lighting. Naturally, critics sometimes sneered, claiming spectacle was replacing substance. But most theatre-goers didn't mind if the plot was shallow, so long as the costumes shimmered and the stage seemed to defy reality. In fact, part of the Edwardian theatre craze rested on this very promise, that for the price of a ticket, you could be transported somewhere extraordinary, somewhere brighter, richer, and far more exciting than your everyday life. So when you picture Edwardian theatre, don't imagine just actors in waistcoats delivering witty lines. Picture Cleopatra descending on a mechanical throne, a storm conjured from smoke and flashing lights, and dancers swirling in sequins that caught the glow of newly installed electric bulbs. One minute you were in ancient Egypt, the next in fairyland. Talk about cheaper than a vacation. If you stepped into an Edwardian theatre and didn't find sequins, chorus lines, or pantomime dames, odds are you were sitting down for Shakespeare. The bard never left the stage, but in Edwardian London, his plays took on a curious double life. Sometimes they were performed with reverence, as though audiences were witnessing the sacred text itself. Other times, directors treated Shakespeare like a flexible draft ripe for rewriting, restaging, or tossing into a blender with popular tastes. Sometimes it was high art, sometimes it was Hamlet with jazz hands. For the theatre elite, Shakespeare was the gold standard. His works symbolized culture, refinement, and national pride. To perform Hamlet, Macbeth, or King Lear was to prove one's seriousness as an actor or manager. Herbert Beerbohm-Tree, for instance, built his reputation on elaborate Shakespearean productions, with scenery so lavish it threatened to eclipse the words themselves. But for Edwardians, the play wasn't just the thing, it was the experience. Shakespeare became less about subtlety and more about spectacle, grandeur, and ensuring that even the clerk in the back row could follow what was happening. To make Shakespeare more accessible, many productions relied on visual excess. Battle scenes were staged with entire armies stomping across the stage, swords clashing and banners waving. A Midsummer Night's Dream wasn't complete without live animals or fairy costumes, so glittery they practically blinded the front row. If you thought Shakespeare's poetry was enough on its own, Edwardian producers disagreed. Why not add a mechanical storm, a chorus of dancers, or, in one ambitious staging, a forest so real that the audience could practically smell the moss? But accessibility wasn't only about spectacle. Edwardian audiences loved a good trimming of Shakespeare's famously wordy scripts. Hours-long monologues could be shortened, entire subplots chopped, and speeches shuffled around to keep things moving. Did the groundlings in the gallery really care about political nuance in Julius Caesar? Probably not, but they'd cheer loudly if Caesar fell down dramatically with enough gusto. Many productions leaned into this populist editing, cutting complexity in favor of clarity, action, and applause lines. And then there were the interpretations. Some actor-managers treated Shakespeare as their personal playground. Tree was notorious for altering texts, adding scenes that Shakespeare never wrote, and inserting elaborate tableaus that slowed the play to a crawl but made audiences gasp. A performance of Hamlet might feature the ghost of King Hamlet walking through a foggy set so detailed it looked like a Gothic postcard. Macbeth could be accompanied by witches flying in from the ceiling, thanks to cleverly hidden wires. Shakespeare may not have asked for these additions, but in Edwardian London, spectacle sold tickets. Comedy also crept into Shakespeare in unexpected ways. While tragedies were meant to be solemn, some productions couldn't resist slipping in visual gags or exaggerated gestures for laughs. Characters who were supposed to be terrifying villains were sometimes played with such melodrama that audiences snickered. A death scene might elicit gasps or giggles, depending on how enthusiastically the actor threw themselves to the ground. Critics wrung their hands at the cheapening of Shakespeare, but audiences seemed perfectly happy to treat Hamlet as both tragedy and entertainment. Interestingly, Shakespeare wasn't only the domain of the grand theatres. Touring companies brought abridged versions to smaller venues, ensuring that working-class audiences also got their dose of the bard. These productions were often stripped-down affairs, performed with minimal sets and enthusiastic but underfunded casts. Still, they carried Shakespeare's name to audiences who might otherwise never encounter him. For many, this was their introduction to the great plays, albeit sometimes in versions so hacked and hurried that Romeo and Juliet ended before the landlord could complain about overtime. Schools also played a role in fueling the craze. Shakespeare was drilled into Edwardian education, and teachers encouraged students to attend live performances to improve their minds. This meant theatres occasionally found themselves packed with restless schoolboys who were less interested in iambic pentameter than in whether the actor playing Romeo might trip on Juliet's gown. Yet even reluctant audiences absorbed Shakespeare by osmosis, and by adulthood, the bard's lines had become part of the cultural wallpaper. Not all adaptations were solemn or faithful. Some producers leaned into modernity, inserting music, dance, and even hints of Edwardian slang to keep things lively. Imagine Twelfth Night with cabaret numbers, or Much Ado About Nothing with choreography that looked suspiciously like a music hall routine. Purists raged, but audiences clapped. Shakespeare, it seemed, was flexible enough to survive almost anything, including jazz hands. The paradox of Shakespeare in Edwardian London was this: he was both revered and reinvented, highbrow and lowbrow. Critics could praise a production for its artistry one night and sneer at a campy interpretation the next, but the bard remained unshakably central to the theatre scene. Whether you came for poetry, pageantry, or pratfalls, there was always a Shakespeare production waiting to meet you halfway, and perhaps that was the true genius of Edwardian Shakespeare. He wasn't trapped in the past. He was reworked, reshaped, and reimagined to fit the tastes of a city buzzing with change. Sometimes it was sublime art, sometimes it was ridiculous spectacle. But either way, the house was full, the applause was loud, and Shakespeare remained the king of the Edwardian stage. Sometimes it was high art, sometimes it was Hamlet with jazz hands, but either way, audiences couldn't get enough. If Edwardian adults had theatres for glittering nights out, children had their own rite of passage, the Saturday matinee. These afternoon shows became an institution, a weekly tradition that promised adventure, laughter, and the occasional sugar rush meltdown in the stalls. Families packed into theatres, herding squirming youngsters into velvet seats, determined to give their offspring a taste of culture. Children learned that theatre was magical, also that sitting still for 3 hours is basically torture. The matinee was in many ways a clever invention. Theatres had empty afternoons to fill, and children were a ready-made audience. Schools didn't run on Saturdays. Working-class parents sometimes had half-days off, and middle-class families loved the idea of wholesome outings. Theatre managers realized that an afternoon show could not only build the next generation of theatre-goers, but also pad their profits. It was cultural education and financial strategy rolled into one. Children's theatre in Edwardian London wasn't a watered-down imitation of adult productions. It had its own identity, playful, fantastical, and designed to keep even the most restless youngsters entertained. Fairy tales were perennial favourites, with productions of Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, and Aladdin tailored specifically for children. Unlike the grand Christmas pantomimes, these matinee shows ran year-round, offering magic in smaller, more digestible doses. The content wasn't always strictly child-safe by modern standards. Edwardian sensibilities about what was appropriate for kids were, shall we say, flexible. Villains might still menace heroines with dramatic flourishes, and slapstick humour often veered into the violent, with pratfalls that would make modern health and safety inspectors weep. But children loved it. Booing the villain, cheering the hero, and gasping at magical transformations were all part of the fun. The audience wasn't expected to sit silently, if anything. Managers encouraged noise, knowing that vocal engagement kept boredom at bay. The shows also doubled as lessons in morality, albeit delivered with sequins and smoke. Good triumphed over evil, courage was rewarded, and laziness punished. Children were meant to leave the theatre inspired to be brave, hard-working and honest. Of course, what most actually remembered was the fairy godmother's sparkly wand, or the acrobat flipping through the air like a human firework. The moral lesson usually evaporated the moment the curtain fell. For parents, the matinee was both joy and ordeal. On the one hand, it provided a safe, structured outing for children. On the other, it meant enduring hours of fidgeting, spilled sweets, and whispered demands for the bathroom. Fathers were often spotted dozing in their seats while mothers tried to maintain order among wriggling children, who found the armrests more fascinating than the performance. One critic famously remarked that the real drama of the Saturday matinee is in the stalls, not the stage. Students also found their way into matinees. While earlier chapters have shown them rowdy in cheap gallery seats at serious plays, here they mingled with younger siblings or neighbors, relishing the excuse to see lighter shows. Teenagers in particular saw matinees as opportunities for discreet socializing. Parents thought they were absorbing culture. In reality, many were flirting, trading gossip, or plotting their next weekend adventure. Children's matinees were also a proving ground for young performers. Aspiring actors and actresses often cut their teeth in these productions, learning to project over the din of chatter and laughter. If you could keep a group of Edwardian schoolchildren focused on Jack and the Beanstalk without them pelting you with toffees, you were well on your way to surviving the rest of the theatrical profession. Some of the great stars of later decades first earned their stripes entertaining children who cared more about beanstalks than soliloquies. Matinee shows didn't always go smoothly. Kids are unpredictable audiences, and performances were peppered with interruptions. A mistimed stage effect could terrify half the stalls into tears. An overzealous child might yell boo at the wrong moment, throwing off the actor's timing. On one infamous occasion, a stage magician pulled a rabbit out of a hat, only for a child in the front row to shout, "That's the same rabbit from last week." The illusion crumbled, and the poor magician never recovered. Still, the magic of the matinee lingered. For many children, this was their first exposure to live theatre, their first glimpse of a stage transforming into enchanted worlds. The memory stuck. Adults who later filled the West End seats often remembered their first Saturday matinee with fondness, recalling the thrill of the curtain rising and the feeling that anything fairies, giants, or dancing animals was possible. It also created a sense of community. Families across London shared the experience, talking about the latest children's production at school, at church, or around the dinner table. The matinee wasn't just entertainment, it was cultural glue, ensuring that theatre remained central to Edwardian life across all ages. So while the evening shows dazzled aristocrats and middle-class couples, the Saturday matinee was the heartbeat of Edwardian childhood. It was noisy, chaotic and exhausting, but it planted seeds of wonder in young minds. For children, it was a weekly ticket to magic. For parents, it was a weekly test of patience. Children learned that theatre was magical. Also that sitting still for 3 hours is basically torture. For all the sequins, fairy tales and chorus lines of Edwardian theatre, not everything was light-hearted glitter. Sometimes the stage became a lightning rod for controversy, poking at the delicate underbelly of Edwardian morality. While most audiences happily hummed along to musical comedies, others found themselves face-to-face with plays that dared to ask uncomfortable questions about society, politics, and the human condition. And when that happened, reactions could be explosive. Some plays shocked audiences so badly they almost spilled their gin, and that was a real crime. At the forefront of this theatrical mischief was George Bernard Shaw. Unlike his contemporaries who leaned on sentiment or spectacle, Shaw wielded the stage like a soapbox. His plays tackled big questions: class inequality, marriage, women's rights, poverty, religion, even prostitution. Mrs. Warren's Profession, for example, told the story of a woman who ran brothels, not exactly the kind of plot Edwardian moral guardians wanted their daughters to hear after tea. The play was banned by the Lord Chamberlain's office, the government body in charge of censoring theatre, but that only added to its notoriety. When it did reach the stage in private clubs, it scandalized and electrified audiences in equal measure. Shaw wasn't alone. Playwrights such as Harley Granville Barker and John Galsworthy also pushed boundaries. Granville Barker's Waste confronted political corruption and abortion, themes so controversial that the censors slammed the brakes on it. Galsworthy's Justice exposed the brutality of the prison system, sparking debates that went far beyond the theatre doors. These were plays that didn't offer easy laughs or happy endings. They demanded audiences think, squirm, and sometimes argue all the way home in their carriages. The Edwardian censorship system only amplified the sense of scandal. Every play had to be licensed by the Lord Chamberlain before performance, which meant officials combed through scripts for anything deemed indecent, blasphemous, or politically dangerous. But censorship was often arbitrary, and playwrights quickly learned that if you wanted to attract attention, you didn't necessarily need approval. A banned play, or one performed only in private club settings, gained a reputation for being daring, forbidden fruit, and in Edwardian London, nothing sold tickets faster than the hint of something you weren't supposed to see. Audiences themselves were a spectacle during scandalous productions. Polite society turned out in droves, half horrified, half thrilled. Some nights the stalls looked like a battlefield, one half of the audience clapping furiously for Shaw's social critique, the other half booing loudly enough to drown out the actors. Fights even broke out in lobbies, as men in top hats shouted about morality, and young women defended their right to hear uncomfortable truths. For critics, this was manna from heaven. Reviews gleefully chronicled the uproar, knowing that readers devoured scandal like dessert. What made these scandals so potent was the cultural clash they revealed. Edwardian society outwardly prided itself on respectability, decorum, and stability, but beneath the polished surface, social tensions simmered. The women's suffrage movement was gaining momentum. Industrial unrest was growing. Poverty and inequality were hard to ignore in a city of glittering theatres and grim slums. The stage became a place where these contradictions could be exposed, often to the horror of those who preferred to keep them hidden. The humour in all this, of course, was the sheer panic of moral guardians. Critics and officials fretted that seeing a play about prostitution might somehow encourage prostitution, or that hearing actors debate politics would destabilise the empire, as if a night at the theatre could undo centuries of British restraint. But audiences weren't so fragile. Many emerged from Shaw's plays amused, intrigued or inspired, and perhaps a little smug about being part of the scandal. Attending a forbidden play was in its own way a social badge of daring. Not all scandals came from weighty themes. Sometimes the shock came from sheer cheek, costumes that showed too much ankle, jokes that leaned too far into innuendo, or actresses delivering lines with a wink that suggested something unspeakable. Edwardians, for all their reputation of restraint, were quick to gasp if a play nudged too hard at propriety, and yet they kept coming back for more, proving that scandal was not just shocking, it was entertaining. The press, ever hungry for headlines, made sure these moments lived longer than the performances themselves. A single controversial play could dominate gossip for weeks. Shaw outrages the stalls, or play banned for vulgarity, screamed newspapers, ensuring that even those who never set foot in a theatre still knew exactly what was going on. The theatre thus became part of the larger public conversation, dragging difficult issues into drawing rooms and pubs whether people liked it or not. In the end, scandal on stage was less about corrupting morals and more about stirring debate. It forced Edwardians to confront the cracks in their own society. Was prison reform necessary? Should women have the right to work independently, even in disreputable professions? Could love and marriage survive the rigid class boundaries? Plays like Shaw's didn't provide answers, but they demanded the questions be asked. So while some Edwardians left the theatre in shock, clutching their pearls and muttering about the decline of civilization, others left exhilarated, thrilled to have glimpsed a piece of truth dressed up in dialogue and stagecraft. Theatre was supposed to entertain, but in these moments it did more. It provoked, it unsettled, and it scandalized. Some plays shocked audiences so badly they almost spilled their gin, and that in Edwardian London was unforgivable. But scandal kept the theatres alive, ensuring that the stage was never just sparkle and sequins, but also a mirror reflecting society's most uncomfortable truths. Every craze needs its icons, and Edwardian theatre was no exception. Beyond the chandeliers, chorus lines, and mechanical stage tricks, the true beating heart of the stage was its stars, actors, and actresses, who became household names, adored, imitated, and occasionally mocked. They were the Kardashians of their day, except with more soliloquies and fewer perfume lines. By 1901, the cult of celebrity was in full swing. The theatre gave audiences more than stories. It gave them personalities to idolize. Posters plastered with famous faces decorated shop windows, collectible postcards of actors sold in their thousands, and gossip columns tracked the latest triumphs and scandals of the theatrical elite. Edwardian Londoners didn't just go to see a play, they went to see a person. Take Ellen Terry, for example. Though her career had begun decades earlier, she remained a towering figure in Edwardian theatre. Known for her luminous stage presence and her Shakespearean roles, Terry embodied the ideal of the great actress. Audiences didn't just admire her talent, they revered her. Her name on a playbill guaranteed attention, and her every performance was treated as an event. If she wept on stage, the stalls wept with her. If she smiled, the whole theatre seemed to glow. Henry Irving, her frequent collaborator and one of the first actors to be knighted, was another giant of the age. Though he died in 1905, his legacy still loomed over Edwardian theatre. Irving had elevated acting to a respected profession, transforming it from something semi-disreputable into an art worthy of national pride. Even after his passing, audiences spoke of him in hushed tones, as though recalling a mythological figure rather than a mere mortal who had once tripped over his cloak during Macbeth. But the Edwardian stage wasn't only about lofty Shakespearean giants, it also teemed with charismatic performers whose flair, beauty, or comedic timing made them household names. Lily Elsie, star of The Merry Widow, captured the public imagination with her charm and fashionable image. Her portrait appeared everywhere, and women copied her hairstyles and gowns. She wasn't just an actress, she was a trendsetter, a living mannequin for Edwardian glamour. Then there was Marie Tempest, known for her wit and versatility, who reigned as one of the great comic actresses of the period. Tempest didn't just play roles, she commanded them, bending scripts and managers alike to her will. Her blend of talent and audacity made her a favorite of audiences and a terror of anyone foolish enough to underestimate her. The public adored her for it. Male actors too enjoyed celebrity status. Gerald du Maurier became the matinee idol of his day, celebrated for his charm and his ability to make audiences swoon with a single well-delivered line. Students, shopgirls, and even married women gushed about him, turning his performances into events that rivaled royal processions. To have seen du Maurier was to have cultural bragging rights, to have missed him was to risk social irrelevance at the office tea table. The culture of celebrity extended beyond the stage. Actors' likenesses were reproduced on postcards, sold at newsstands, and collected in scrapbooks. Fans exchanged them like trading cards, boasting about the rarest or most beautiful designs. It was the Edwardian version of following stars on Instagram, except instead of likes, you had carefully glued postcards in an album you showed off at dinner parties. With celebrity came gossip, and Edwardians loved nothing more than a good scandal. Rumors of affairs, feuds between actors, or extravagant behavior behind the scenes filled the newspapers. Was that leading lady truly feuding with her understudy? Did the star really throw a tantrum over the size of her dressing room? Readers devoured every detail, delighted to imagine that the people who made them laugh or cry on stage were just as dramatic off it. What's remarkable is how star performers influenced not just theatre, but culture itself. They shaped fashion, mannerisms, even speech. If Ellen Terry wore a gown of a certain cut, copies appeared in London shops within weeks. If Gerald du Maurier delivered a line in a particular rhythm, young men at dinner parties tried to mimic it. Stars weren't just entertainers, They were cultural tastemakers, setting trends with every role they played. Yet celebrity also carried burdens. Just as today, the more famous the star, the more their private life became public property. Paparazzi didn't exist yet, but gossip writers filled the gap. Some stars embraced the attention, feeding reporters juicy tidbits. Others loathed it, retreating from the spotlight when they could. But the demand for news about actors was insatiable. For Edwardian audiences, theatre stars were both larger than life and strangely intimate, people you felt you knew, even if you only glimpsed them from the back row of the gods. In many ways, this culture of celebrity cemented the theatre craze itself. Audiences didn't just go for plays, they went for personalities. They laughed at Tempest, swooned over Du Maurier, and admired Terry as though she were the living embodiment of art itself. The stars kept the theatres full, the gossip mills spinning, and the Edwardian imagination buzzing. They were the Kardashians of their day, except with more soliloquies and fewer perfume lines. And in the glittering world of Edwardian theatre, their fame wasn't just entertainment, it was the fuel that kept the entire craze alive. If the music hall was the people's playground, the opera house was the aristocracy's gilded fortress. In Edwardian London, opera wasn't just a form of entertainment, it was an event, a social ritual, and occasionally an excuse to be seen in diamonds the size of goose eggs. While clerks and shop girls were laughing at slapstick in the gallery, dukes and duchesses were sipping champagne in Covent Garden, nodding gravely through 4 hours of tragic arias. Opera was the high temple of culture, though many of its devotees seemed more interested in the foyer than the actual singing. The Royal Opera House at Covent Garden was the epicenter of this rarefied world. Its ornate facade and lavish interior set the tone. You weren't just attending a performance, you were entering a palace. Marble pillars, golden chandeliers, and plush red velvet framed the stage, ensuring that even before the soprano opened her mouth, audiences felt they had witnessed something magnificent. This wasn't theatre for the masses, this was theatre for those who had titles, fortunes, or at the very least, a very persuasive tailor. Opera seasons were carefully curated social calendars. The aristocracy didn't simply attend performances, they occupied them, turning the opera house into an extension of the drawing room. Private boxes were jealously guarded family treasures, passed down like heirlooms, and often more about displaying the occupants than seeing the stage. To stroll past the boxes was to take in a fashion show of gowns, jewels, and carefully orchestrated glances. If you actually wanted to see the opera, the stalls were a safer bet, though you risked being mistaken for a social climber with cultural ambitions. As for the music itself, opera plots were notoriously convoluted. Even devoted fans occasionally struggled to keep track of who was in love, who was disguised, and who was about to be stabbed in a tragic finale. If you didn't understand the plot, don't worry, neither did anyone else. What mattered was the sheer sound, soaring sopranos, booming basses and orchestras swelling with Wagnerian grandeur. It didn't matter if the libretto was in Italian, French, or German. Many attendees couldn't understand a word but nodded along solemnly, as if fluent in every European language by sheer force of will. For true aficionados, opera was an art form to be revered. Edwardian London imported the finest singers from across Europe, with star performers commanding astronomical fees. Enrico Caruso, perhaps the greatest tenor of his generation, sang at Covent Garden to rapturous applause. Crowds lined up not only for his voice, but also for the bragging rights of saying they had heard him live. Opera singers were international celebrities, their names whispered in reverent tones at dinner tables and splashed across society columns. To miss a Caruso performance was to admit you had failed as a cultured Edwardian. Yet opera was as much about social maneuvering as music. Intermissions were the real performance for many attendees. Corridors and foyers buzzed with gossip, flirtations, and discreet negotiations. Marriages were plotted, alliances cemented, and scandals whispered behind gloved hands. Some society watchers claimed that the Opera House foyer accomplished more diplomacy in one evening than Parliament did in a month. Of course, opera also had its critics. Some saw it as a gaudy indulgence for the rich, inaccessible to ordinary people, and hopelessly out of touch. Tickets for the best seats cost more than a week's wages for many workers, making opera an unattainable dream for the majority. Even when cheaper seats were offered, the social atmosphere could be forbidding. One wag quipped that the only thing more tragic than an opera plot was the sight of a clerk trying to look comfortable in the company of duchesses. Despite the exclusivity, opera held symbolic importance. It was a cultural crown jewel, proof of London's place among the great European capitals. Just as Paris had the Opera and Milan had La Scala, London had Covent Garden, a statement that Britain could compete not only in trade and empire but in art. Attending opera was a way for the elite to reassure themselves and each other that they were not just wealthy but also refined. The productions themselves were feats of scale. Lavish costumes, enormous choruses, and full orchestras combined to create spectacles that rivaled any West End extravaganza. Wagnerian operas demanded hours of endurance, with singers belting through acts so long that even the most patient dukes shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Italian operas, with their sweeping romantic melodies, often left audiences humming as they exited, though the more cynical suggested they were humming simply to stay awake. For those truly engaged, opera was transcendent. For the less engaged, it was at least an excellent excuse to wear one's finest attire, drink champagne, and whisper about who had been seen in whose box. Either way, opera defined Edwardian high culture. It wasn't democratic, it wasn't cheap, and it wasn't particularly accessible, but it was dazzling, imposing, and utterly inseparable from the self-image of the Edwardian elite. So while music halls roared with laughter and the West End sparkled with musical comedy, the opera house remained the domain of the privileged few. For them, it was less about understanding the intricacies of a tragic aria, and more about being present, nodding knowingly, and letting the world know they had been there. If you didn't understand the plot, don't worry, neither did anyone else. What mattered was that your diamonds caught the light, your champagne stayed chilled, and your presence was noticed. That, in Edwardian London, was opera at its finest. The Edwardian theatre craze wasn't only about dazzling costumes or catchy tunes, it was also about people watching. For perhaps the first time in London's history, the theatre became a rare place where dukes, clerks, shopgirls and students all gathered in one building, laughing at the same jokes and gasping at the same twists. Of course, the Edwardian social order didn't dissolve the moment you entered the lobby. Seating was a map of the class system. One box seat for the rich, one gallery for the poor. Same jokes, different seating chart. The hierarchy of the theatre was immediately visible. The boxes, perched along the sides, were the preserve of the wealthy and titled. These weren't seats so much as miniature drawing rooms draped in velvet, where families displayed their status as much as they watched the play. To sit in a box was less about appreciating Shakespeare and more about ensuring your diamond tiara caught the spotlight at just the right angle. Gossip swirled in these compartments. Who had arrived late, who was sitting with whom, and whether Lady So-and-so's gown was fashionable or an affront to civilization. The stalls, directly in front of the stage, attracted the solidly middle-class clerks, professionals, shop owners and their families. They had paid good money for their tickets, and they expected a proper show. Stalls' audiences were often enthusiastic but respectful, clapping at the right moments and laughing with just enough decorum to remind everyone they weren't from the gallery. It was a balancing act, enjoying the show while also proving you belonged in the heart of respectable Edwardian society. And then, high above were the galleries, affectionately, or not so affectionately, known as the gods. Here sat the working-class crowds, students, shopgirls and labourers who had scraped together a few coins for the cheapest seats. The view was often terrible, the benches hard, and the air thin, but none of that dampened their enthusiasm. Gallery audiences shouted, booed, and cheered with abandon, injecting raw energy into the performance. Actors dreaded or adored the gods depending on whether they won their approval. A laugh from the gallery could feel like triumph. Silence could be devastating. The mixing of classes didn't mean everyone mingled. A duchess wasn't likely to sit elbow to elbow with a factory worker, but they were all in the same building, reacting to the same story. In a rigidly stratified society, that mattered. For a few hours, laughter cut across class lines. A pratfall was just as funny in the boxes as in the gallery. A villain's comeuppance drew cheers from both silk gowns and patched jackets. The Edwardian theatre, with all its velvet and varnish, became one of the few cultural spaces that united London, even if it was unity by way of segregated seating. Intermissions revealed these contrasts even more vividly. In the boxes, champagne corks popped and gossip flowed as smoothly as the wine. In the stalls, couples strolled the foyer, admiring the chandeliers and pretending not to notice who was staring at whom. Meanwhile, in the gallery, the intermission usually meant rushing for a quick pint or trading jokes in the corridors. Each class had its ritual, but all were bound by the shared experience of waiting for the curtain to rise again. This class mixing had subtle cultural consequences. For the working classes, theatres offered glimpses into worlds of wealth and refinement, even if seen from afar. Watching aristocrats glide into their boxes was its own form of entertainment. For the wealthy, theatres provided a carefully controlled proximity to the masses, a reminder that yes, ordinary people also existed, but thankfully several rows away. It was a form of cohabitation without true mingling, a delicate balance that somehow worked. Theatres themselves leaned into this structure, designing buildings with clear social divisions. Grand staircases swept the rich into their boxes, while narrow side stairways funneled the working classes up to the rafters. The architecture reinforced the hierarchy, but it also reinforced the sense that everyone, regardless of rank, had a place in the theatre. Whether you entered through the main doors under chandeliers or the side entrance tucked beside the alley, you were part of the same event. The different behaviors of audiences became part of the theatrical experience. Actors had to calibrate their performances, a subtle gesture for the stalls, a booming delivery for the gallery. Some actors even joked that they performed 3 versions of every play simultaneously, one for the critics in the boxes, one for the polite applause of the stalls, and one for the raucous approval of the gods. If they could win all 3, they knew the night was a triumph. Critics often wrung their hands at this mixing, worrying that the theatre was losing its refinement by admitting so many ordinary people. But in reality, the vitality of Edwardian theatre depended on this cross-class appeal. Without the rowdy cheers from the gallery, the sparkle of the boxes would have felt hollow. Without the financial stability of the middle-class stalls, the whole enterprise would have collapsed. It was precisely the blend of audiences that gave Edwardian theatre its unique energy. In a city where class defined everything, your job, your clothes, your accent, even where you could live, the theatre was a rare equalizer, if only for a few hours. Everyone laughed at the same pratfalls, swooned at the same romances, and gasped at the same stage tricks. They did so from very different seats, but they did it together. One box seat for the rich, one gallery for the poor. Same jokes, different seating chart. And in Edwardian London, that was as close to social mixing as you were likely to get. If Edwardian theatres dazzled with costumes, lights, and chorus lines, they also thrived on something less tangible but just as important: words. At the heart of the Edwardian theatre craze was the playwright, the clever pen behind the curtain, whose dialogue could make audiences roar with laughter or sit in stunned silence. After Oscar Wilde's meteoric rise and catastrophic fall in the 1890s, Edwardian playwrights inherited his legacy of razor-sharp wit, while adding their own flavors of satire, sentiment, and social critique. Their jokes were so sharp they could cut bread thinner than Edwardian bakers ever managed. The Edwardian stage was a proving ground for dramatists of every kind: wits, moralists, idealists, and cynics. Wilde's influence lingered long after his imprisonment. His sparkling comedies, The Importance of Being Earnest, Lady Windermere's Fan remained audience favorites, ensuring that the Edwardian public was primed to love plays filled with witty repartee and sly social commentary. But Wilde was more than a playwright. He was a style. His successors knew that audiences wanted banter, paradoxes, and drawing-room duels fought with words instead of swords. Enter playwrights like J.M. Barrie, whose light touch balanced whimsy with heart. Though best known today for Peter Pan, which premiered in 1904, Barry also wrote drawing-room plays that danced on the edges of comedy and melancholy. His works were quieter than Wilde's but no less artful, weaving irony and sentiment into stories that lingered long after the curtain fell. Where Wilde had mocked society's absurdities with a wink, Barry often hinted at the wistfulness hiding beneath Edwardian surfaces, the longing for lost youth, the tension between duty and desire. Then there was George Bernard Shaw, who wielded dialogue like a rapier. If Wilde had been champagne, Shaw was whiskey-biting, bracing, and impossible to ignore. His plays fused humor with political purpose, ridiculing hypocrisy while driving home uncomfortable truths. Man and Superman, Major Barbara, Pygmalion. Each was packed with lines so sharp that audiences laughed first and realized they'd been criticized later. Shaw's dialogue was conversation as combat, his characters sparring not just for laughs but for ideas. He wanted audiences to think, but he knew they'd only listen if he made them laugh along the way. Shaw's wit was notorious for being too clever by half, but that was part of the appeal. His lines cut across Edwardian society, skewering aristocrats, clergy, and industrialists alike. For audiences weary of syrupy melodramas, Shaw's satire felt invigorating, like a brisk slap with a well-phrased paradox. He didn't just entertain, he provoked, proving that theatre could be both funny and revolutionary. Edwardian audiences adored clever dialogue, and other playwrights rose to the challenge. Somerset Maugham carved out a reputation for comedies of manners that blended wit with cynicism. His plays like Lady Frederick and the Circle turned drawing rooms into verbal battlegrounds, where characters traded quips like poker chips. Maugham's dialogue was sharp, worldly, and often tinged with resignation, perfect for an era balancing optimism and anxiety about the modern world. The period also saw female playwrights making inroads, using wit to challenge stereotypes and expand the boundaries of theatrical storytelling. Precisely Hamilton's Diana of Dobson's 1908 offered biting commentary on women's economic struggles, packaged in humor sharp enough to draw laughs and applause from mixed audiences. Her work, alongside Elizabeth Baker's Chains, proved that punchlines could be political, and that women playwrights could wield wit with just as much force as their male counterparts. Audiences lapped it up. Edwardian theatre-goers loved being in on the joke, relishing dialogue that made them feel clever just for laughing. A well-placed quip could travel far beyond the stage, repeated at dinner tables, quoted in newspapers, and whispered in office corridors. Playwrights became cultural commentators, their jokes fueling not only performances but everyday conversations. In a way, they were the Edwardian equivalent of Twitter, sharp, pithy, and endlessly repeatable. The artistry of Edwardian dialogue was also a reflection of its audience. London was a city brimming with conversation. In cafes, clubs, and drawing rooms, people prided themselves on repartee, and the theatre became both mirror and training ground for verbal dexterity. Watching Shaw or Maugham was as much about entertainment as it was about sharpening your own conversational arsenal. After all, what better way to impress at a dinner party than to recycle a witty line from last night's play? But wit could be a double-edged sword. Critics sometimes accused playwrights of hiding thin plots behind clever banter. Did the story matter, or were audiences simply dazzled by verbal fireworks? Shaw dismissed such complaints with characteristic irony, pointing out that if people left the theatre talking about his dialogue, he had already won. The playwright's punchlines, in other words, were the plot. The Edwardian craze for witty plays cemented the idea that theatre was not only spectacle, but also conversation, a duel of ideas dressed up in jokes. The playwrights gave audiences laughter, but also permission to laugh at themselves, their society, and their pretensions. And that was no small gift in a world wobbling between Victorian restraint and modern upheaval. Their jokes were so sharp they could cut bread thinner than Edwardian bakers ever managed. And for audiences hungry for both laughter and insight, the Edwardian playwrights delivered a feast of words that defined an era. The Edwardian theatre craze wasn't only about men in frock coats running playhouses or chorus lines dazzling in sequins. Women too were carving out space, not just as pretty faces under the spotlight, but as performers, playwrights, and even directors who demanded to be heard. Some women found their voice on stage, others found it yelling at critics. Either way, Edwardian theatre was increasingly impossible to imagine without them. On stage, actresses were at the height of their cultural influence. By 1901, the profession had shaken off much of the stigma that had clung to it in earlier centuries. No longer dismissed as disreputable, actresses were now stars in their own right, commanding both adoration and respect. Figures like Ellen Terry and Mrs. Patrick Campbell weren't just popular performers. They were cultural icons, known for their artistry, charisma, and the ability to dominate a stage full of men who thought they were the main event. The roles for women were expanding too. While plenty of scripts still confined them to playing ingenues, damsels, or scheming vamps, others allowed actresses to explore greater depth and complexity. Shaw, ever the provocateur, wrote women who were witty, independent, and challenging characters who could spar with men intellectually and often win. Campbell's famous turn as Eliza Doolittle in Pygmalion showed audiences that a flower seller could command the stage every bit as powerfully as a professor of phonetics. For young women in the stalls, watching these performances was electric. Theatre wasn't just about being admired, it was about speaking, thinking, and holding one's own. Behind the scenes, women were also pushing boundaries. Playwrights like Cicely Hamilton and Elizabeth Baker used the stage to tell stories that male dramatists largely ignored. Hamilton's Diana of Dobson's gave voice to the struggles of shopgirls, the exhaustion, the low pay, the constant fight for independence. Baker's Chains depicted the quiet despair of working-class women trapped in limited opportunities. These plays weren't just witty, they were revolutionary in shining a light on women's lives with authenticity and empathy. They didn't ask for permission to be heard, they simply demanded it, curtain up and lights blazing. Women were also experimenting with directing and producing, roles still dominated by men. It wasn't easy. The Edwardian theatre world was filled with gatekeepers who thought women's natural place was in front of the footlights, not calling the shots behind them. Yet some women managed to push through, often working in smaller companies, progressive theatre societies, or suffrage-linked productions. These spaces allowed women to test their creative authority, setting the stage quite literally for the breakthroughs of later decades. The suffrage movement gave theatre women another layer of visibility. Many actresses and playwrights were active supporters of the cause, and some even used performances to raise funds or awareness. Actresses like Christabel Pankhurst and Cicely Hamilton gave public lectures and performances supporting votes for women, blending artistry with activism. For these women, the stage wasn't just a career, it was a platform, a megaphone through which political ideas could be broadcast to eager audiences. Of course, critics weren't always kind. Some reviewers treated actresses with condescension, praising their looks before mentioning their talent, or implying that a female playwright's work must secretly have been guided by a man. Women responded the best way they knew how, by writing sharper plays, delivering stronger performances, and occasionally mocking critics in print. One can imagine Hamilton rolling her eyes and muttering, "If I wanted a man to take credit, I'd let him pay my rent too." The rise of women in theatre also shifted social norms. Female performers and playwrights lived lives that were more independent than most Edwardian women could imagine. They earned wages, mingled in creative circles, and sometimes lived unconventionally, unmarried, outspoken, and defiantly modern. While newspapers occasionally clutched their pearls over this, many ordinary women admired it. To see a woman succeed on her own terms was thrilling, even if you yourself were stuck behind a shop counter 6 days a week. For audiences, the presence of strong women on stage and behind the scenes subtly reshaped expectations. Edwardian theatregoers became accustomed to hearing female voices deliver not only love songs but biting satire, political critiques, and fiery monologues. Theatre wasn't just men declaiming in booming voices anymore. It was women insisting on being heard, even when society wanted them to stay quiet. The result was a richer, more varied theatre culture. Edwardian drama gained depth because women were shaping it, not just appearing in it. Their voices added nuance, humour, and new perspectives, ensuring that plays reflected more of the society that filled the seats. They weren't simply ornaments to spectacle, they were engines of creativity. Some women found their voice on stage, others found it yelling at critics, and by doing so they changed Edwardian theatre forever. Whether dazzling in lead roles, writing their own scripts, or quietly directing backstage, women proved that the stage belonged to them just as much as it did to the men in frock coats, and audiences, whether they admitted it or not, were better off for it. Not every Edwardian could hop on a train to London to bask in the West End's glittering chandeliers. Luckily for them, the theatre didn't just stay in the capital. It packed its costumes, scripts, and occasionally its temperamental actors into railway carriages and went on the road. Touring companies carried the Edwardian theatre craze to towns and cities across Britain and even abroad, making theatre a national and sometimes international phenomenon. Theatre went on tour before boy bands made it cool. The expansion of railways was the unsung hero of this cultural spread. By the early 20th century, Britain's rail network was vast, linking London to industrial towns, seaside resorts and rural counties. This meant theatre companies could pack up a production in London and within a few days be performing the same show in Manchester, Glasgow or Bristol. Scenery, costumes and props were loaded into wagons, while actors endured long, uncomfortable journeys, often arriving just in time to dash onto the stage with barely a rehearsal. The magic on stage was often built on logistical chaos of it. Touring was crucial because it gave regional audiences access to the same cultural excitement enjoyed in the capital. West End hits were restaged in smaller theatres, ensuring that shop clerks in Leeds or shipbuilders in Newcastle could laugh at the same comedies and swoon at the same tragedies as Londoners. For many, this was their first chance to see serious theatre performed live, making touring companies vital ambassadors of Edwardian culture. But tours weren't limited to serious drama. Musical comedies, pantomimes and variety acts all hit the road. Pantomime, in particular, was a guaranteed success in provincial theatres during the Christmas season. Touring companies brought with them not only actors and sets but also the tradition of audience participation, ensuring that children in Birmingham could shriek "He's behind you" with as much gusto as their London cousins. Life in a touring company was not glamorous. Actors often complained about drafty lodgings, endless travel, and unpredictable pay. Some theatres were well equipped and grand, others were shabby halls with creaky stages that threatened to collapse under an energetic dance number. Weather added another layer of unpredictability. Imagine trudging through a snowstorm to perform Hamlet in Aberdeen, only to discover that half the audience couldn't make it past the drifts. Yet the show went on, sometimes to packed houses, sometimes to a few brave souls huddled in the front row. For actors, touring was a rite of passage. Many cut their teeth in provincial tours before earning a chance at the West End. It was grueling but formative work, teaching resilience, adaptability, and the ability to perform in less than ideal circumstances. An actor who could handle a heckling crowd in Sheffield or a collapsing set in Portsmouth could handle anything. The road, with all its hardships, was the forge that produced seasoned performers. Touring also created a shared theatrical culture across Britain. Audiences in small towns became just as invested in theatre gossip as their metropolitan counterparts. They read about stars in newspapers and then saw those same performers in their local theatres. A visit from a famous London actor was a major event, sometimes drawing audiences from miles around. It blurred the divide between the capital and the provinces, making theatre feel like a national experience rather than a London monopoly. International tours took the craze even further. British companies travelled to Europe, America and the colonies, spreading Edwardian theatre to audiences abroad. Shakespeare in particular became an exportable cultural treasure, staged in cities from New York to Bombay. Touring companies often billed themselves as representatives of English culture, carrying with them both artistic ambition and a whiff of imperial pride. If Britain ruled the waves, it also ruled the stage, or so the marketing claimed. Of course, international touring came with its own mishaps. Shipping sets across the Atlantic was a nightmare, and performers sometimes found themselves performing Shakespeare to audiences who barely understood English. Reviews from abroad often reflected both fascination and bewilderment. One American critic described a touring production of King Lear as majestic, though occasionally incomprehensible, and not just because of the accents. Still, these tours cemented Britain's reputation as a global theatrical powerhouse. Back home, touring companies played an important social role. In industrial towns, they provided much-needed relief from long hours in factories. In seaside resorts, they became part of the holiday experience, giving families entertainment after a day of braving cold waves. For rural communities, a touring company's arrival was headline news, sometimes advertised weeks in advance with posters plastered on every available wall. The excitement of a show rolling into town was half the fun. Critics in London sometimes sniffed that touring productions were second-rate, with cut-down sets and less polished performances. But for regional audiences they were anything but. The thrill of seeing live theatre outweighed the missing chandeliers or smaller choruses, and occasionally a touring production rivaled or even surpassed its London counterpart, proving that talent and energy mattered more than budget. The Edwardian craze for theatre wasn't confined to the West End's glittering avenues. It spread along railway lines across oceans and into towns that had never dreamed of hosting Shakespeare or musical comedy. Touring companies democratized theatre, making it part of everyday life across Britain and beyond. Theatre went on tour before boy bands made it cool, and in doing so it turned a London craze into a cultural phenomenon that reached far beyond the capital's foggy streets. If the Edwardians loved anything more than a night out at the theatre, it was the thrill of novelty. By the early 20th century, theatres weren't just cultural landmarks, they were laboratories of innovation where technology dazzled audiences as much as the acting. Electric lighting, rotating stages, and even the first flickering films transformed the theatre-going experience. Spotlights made actors shine, literally, sometimes to the point of melting makeup. The introduction of electric light was perhaps the most dramatic shift. Gaslight, which had dominated 19th century theatres, was temperamental, smoky, and dangerous. Entire auditoriums had been known to go up in flames faster than a villain's monologue if a lamp tipped over. Electricity promised safety, consistency, and brilliance. Theatres glowed with a clarity audiences had never seen before. Faces were visible, sets gleamed, and costumes sparkled under the new glare. For performers, though, this came with a downside. No shadow meant no mercy. Every blemish, every bead of sweat, every poorly applied bit of rouge was suddenly visible to the back row. Some actors adjusted by slathering on thicker makeup. Others discovered, to their horror, that their careers had depended on dim lighting. Electric spotlights added an entirely new dimension. Actors could now be singled out in pools of light, heightening dramatic tension. A heroine illuminated in radiant glow became almost ethereal, while a villain lurking in shadow looked all the more sinister. Stage managers, of course, had to learn how to use this new tool effectively. An ill-timed spotlight could ruin a scene, especially if it accidentally highlighted the stagehand sneaking behind the curtain. Still, the possibilities were endless, and directors embraced the chance to choreograph light as carefully as dialogue. Beyond lighting, mechanical staging introduced fresh wonders. Rotating stages, borrowed from innovations in Japan and adapted for Edwardian audiences, allowed seamless scene changes. Instead of waiting for the curtain to drop while crews scrambled to rearrange sets, the entire floor could spin, whisking audiences from a palace to a battlefield in seconds. Audiences gasped at the smooth transitions, though a few unlucky actors discovered the perils of standing on a moving platform in the wrong shoes. One slip, and what should have been a noble entrance turned into slapstick. Trapdoors, lifts, and hydraulic machinery grew more ambitious, allowing performers to rise from the underworld, vanish into the floor, or descend from the heavens with mechanical precision. At least that was the idea. In practice, machines occasionally stuck. A goddess might find herself dangling awkwardly mid-air, or a villain rising from a trapdoor might get stuck halfway, leaving only his head poking out while the audience roared with laughter. Technology brought spectacle, but it also introduced a new genre of unplanned comedy, the mechanical mishap. Meanwhile, a new competitor was emerging, cinema. By the 1900s, film was no longer a novelty shown in fairgrounds. It was creeping into permanent venues across London. Moving pictures could show exotic landscapes, thrilling chases, and special effects that live theatre struggled to match. For a penny, you could watch a cowboy gallop across the American plains, or a train appear to race straight at the screen. Compared to the price of a theatre ticket, the allure was obvious. The theatre world bristled at this upstart medium, dismissing cinema as shallow entertainment for the masses. But privately, many managers worried, could flickering images steal their audiences? The early answer was adaptation. Some theatres incorporated short films into variety programs, treating them as just another act sandwiched between jugglers and singers. Others doubled down on live spectacle, emphasizing the one thing cinema couldn't replicate: the thrill of flesh and blood performers sharing the same space as the audience. After all, a screen could never give you the satisfaction of booing a villain in real time. Technology also reshaped audience expectations. Edwardians were living in an age of innovation. Telephones, automobiles, and airplanes were transforming daily life. They wanted their entertainment to reflect that modern spirit. A theatre that still relied on dim gas lamps and creaky scenery looked hopelessly old-fashioned compared to competitors boasting electric marvels. Managers invested heavily in the latest equipment, knowing that audiences would happily pay extra for the thrill of progress. The combination of electricity, mechanics, and cinematic influence gave Edwardian theatre a distinctive flavour, part tradition, part innovation, and always just a little precarious. While Shakespeare's words or Shaw's quips provided intellectual stimulation, it was often the glow of a spotlight or the sudden whir of a rotating stage that made audiences gasp. The theatre became a place where art and technology courted each other, not always gracefully, but always memorably. For the actors, these changes demanded adaptation. They had to project not only their voices but also their presence in a new technological landscape. Under the harsh clarity of electric light, subtle gestures mattered more. Directors choreographed movements with machinery in mind, timing entrances to coincide with lighting shifts or rotating platforms. The old art of declaiming lines was now intertwined with the new science of stagecraft. Technology also shaped the rhythms of theatre life. Faster scene changes meant longer, more elaborate productions were possible, keeping audiences glued to their seats. Theatres could stage grand historical epics with multiple locations, confident that machinery could handle the transitions. It was as though the theatre itself had become another performer, one with its own quirks and personality. In short, Edwardian theatre embraced technology with the same gusto it embraced sequins, champagne and scandal. Electric lights illuminated every corner. Rotating stages kept stories moving, and early cinema pushed theatre to innovate harder than ever before. Spotlights made actors shine literally, sometimes to the point of melting makeup, but they also reminded audiences that the Edwardian stage was at the cutting edge of modernity. Edwardian actors lived in fear of many things: forgotten lines, missed cues, and trapdoors that refused to open. But the greatest terror of all lurked not in the wings but in the morning paper. Theatre critics could make or break a production with a single sentence, and caricaturists sharpened their pens to lampoon stars with merciless glee. In the age of Edward VII, the stage wasn't confined to velvet curtains. It spilled into the columns of newspapers and the pages of satirical magazines. A bad review could kill a play faster than a collapsing stage prop. The explosion of newspapers and periodicals gave critics unprecedented reach. By breakfast the morning after a premiere, the fate of a play could already be sealed. If the critics praised it, audiences flocked. If they panned it, empty seats loomed like a death knell. Edwardian audiences didn't have rotten tomatoes, but they had a chorus of well-paid voices ready to tell them whether their evening was worth the price of a ticket. Some critics became celebrities in their own right. Figures like William Archer, an advocate for modern drama, and A.B. Wockley, known for his sharp wit, wielded immense influence. Their prose was often as theatrical as the plays they reviewed, dripping with sarcasm, brimming with metaphors, and occasionally more entertaining than the performance itself. Audiences relished these reviews almost as much as the shows, especially when a critic unleashed a particularly savage takedown. Imagine reading that an actor's Hamlet had all the gravitas of a startled chicken. Cruel, yes, but undeniably memorable. Critics weren't just about entertainment value, though. They also shaped debates about what theatre should be. Should it entertain or educate? Should it prioritize spectacle or substance? Should it push boundaries or protect morals? When Shaw's plays hit the stage, critics sparred furiously over whether his brand of social satire was genius or dangerous drivel. These public battles elevated theatre from mere pastime to cultural battleground. Alongside the reviews came caricatures. Magazines like Punch and illustrated papers filled their pages with exaggerated sketches of actors, playwrights, and critics themselves. Caricature was both satire and celebration, a sign you had arrived in the public eye, even if the artist gave you a nose the size of a teapot. Some actors loathed it. Others collected caricatures of themselves, displaying them like trophies. A cartoon could exaggerate a performer's gestures into absurdity. The grand sweep of an arm, the flutter of eyelashes, the melodramatic clutching of a chest, distilling entire performances into a single comic image. For audiences, caricatures added another layer of fun to the theatre craze. Even if you couldn't afford tickets to see a famous actor, you could buy a magazine and laugh at their likeness. The theatre world entered homes, not just through gossip columns but through drawings pinned up in pubs or snipped out for scrapbooks. It was theatre without tickets, comedy without curtain calls. The symbiosis between stage and press became essential. Theatres needed publicity, and critics needed copy. Managers courted favourable reviews with free seats and well-timed flattery, while actors alternated between cursing critics and inviting them backstage for champagne. Everyone pretended it was about art. Everyone knew it was also about survival. But the power of the press wasn't absolute. Sometimes a play critics loathed found life through sheer audience enthusiasm. Working-class crowds in the gallery weren't necessarily swayed by what a London intellectual wrote over his morning tea. They cared more about whether the jokes landed and the costumes dazzled. Still, the influence of reviews on middle-class and elite theatre-goers meant that critics held enormous sway over financial success. There was humour, too, in how critics could become as theatrical as the actors they judged. A.B. Wockley once dismissed a production with the line, "The scenery deserved better actors." Another lamented that a new comedy generated less laughter than a tax return. These zingers became their own kind of performance, eagerly clipped and quoted by readers. Critics, in essence, performed for their audiences just as much as the actors did, only with ink instead of stage lights. Caricatures carried their own sting. An actor who fancied himself dignified might open Punch to find his likeness transformed into a preening rooster. A playwright dreaming of serious intellectual impact might discover his caricature as a schoolboy scribbling on a chalkboard. The laughter of the public was inescapable. The theatre may have belonged to actors and managers, but in the press, the last word belonged to the pen. And yet, for all the mockery, criticism, and caricature fueled the Edwardian theatre craze. Reviews sparked debate, caricatures spread recognition, and the back and forth between stage and press made theatre feel like everyone's business. Even those who rarely went to a performance could keep up with who had triumphed, who had bombed, and who had been immortalized with a giant chin in Punch. A bad review could kill a play faster than a collapsing stage prop, but it could also keep people talking, arguing, and laughing long after the curtain fell. In Edwardian London, theatre didn't end when the actors bowed. It lived on in headlines, sketches, and the ink-stained wit of critics who turned reviews into their own form of entertainment. The Edwardian stage was more than an evening's amusement. It was a mirror, sometimes flattering, sometimes uncomfortably honest, reflecting what Britain thought of itself at the dawn of the 20th century. In an age of empire, class pride, and simmering social change, plays weren't just entertainment. They were subtle lessons in who you were, or at least who you wished you were after 3 brandies. At the national level, theatre often reinforced Britain's self-image as a global power. Historical dramas brimmed with patriotic fervour, resurrecting kings, queens and warriors from the past to remind audiences that they were heirs to greatness. Shakespeare's histories, especially Henry V, became vehicles for patriotic pride, their lines ringing with fresh resonance in an empire that stretched across the globe. To watch Henry rally his troops at Agincourt was to imagine Britain's imperial mission echoed on Edwardian battlefields. Audiences left the theatre not just entertained but reassured. Britain was strong, noble, and destined for leadership, but theatre also betrayed anxieties beneath the surface. Plays about empire often doubled as cautionary tales, revealing cracks in the facade of confidence. Colonial-themed productions sometimes included villains from abroad or plots centered on civilizing missions, which reflected unease about maintaining control of far-flung territories. The exotic settings, jungles, deserts, or faraway cities provided spectacle, but they also whispered fears about cultural clashes and the fragility of imperial authority. Behind the patriotic trumpets lurked the question, could Britain really keep its empire together? Closer to home, the theatre mirrored Edwardian society's rigid class structure. Drawing-room comedies sparkled with the manners of the upper crust, teaching audiences how proper society should behave, while poking gentle fun at those who fell short. Middle-class viewers delighted in watching aristocrats trip over their own etiquette, while also aspiring to copy their fashions and speech. Theatre thus became both a celebration of hierarchy and a sly critique of it, reminding everyone of their place while giving them permission to laugh at their betters. The stage also reflected the tension between tradition and modernity. Edwardians were caught between Victorian restraint and the onrushing energy of the 20th century. Plays often dramatized this struggle, young lovers clashing with parental expectations, ambitious women testing the limits of social convention, or bold new ideas colliding with old customs. Audiences recognized themselves in these conflicts. They might leave the theatre chuckling at the absurdities of fictional characters, but the laughter carried an edge of recognition. Religion and morality, too, found their way onto the stage. Though overtly pious plays were rare, the themes of virtue, temptation, and redemption cropped up constantly. Audiences liked seeing wicked characters punished and good ones rewarded, even if goodness was sometimes stretched to include cheeky heroines who bent the rules. The plays reassured Edwardians that their moral compass was intact, even as the realities of industrial cities and shifting gender roles made that compass wobble. Women's roles on stage also played into national identity. The glamorous actresses, witty heroines, and bold female characters embodied Britain's modern spirit, suggesting that the nation could evolve without losing its essential character. Yet they also provoked anxieties about women stepping beyond traditional roles. Were these heroines models for change, or dangerous influences undermining family stability? The debate mirrored the wider suffrage movement, with the stage becoming a symbolic arena where the nation argued with itself through fictional characters. Comedy, of course, softened the blows. Satirical plays allowed audiences to laugh at their own quirks while quietly absorbing commentary about society. A farce about bumbling politicians might provoke belly laughs, but it also left viewers thinking about the real Parliament across the Thames. Satire worked because it entertained first and preached second, or, in some cases, didn't bother to preach at all. The laughter itself was enough to reinforce shared values. The British could take a joke even at their own expense. What's striking is how theatre allowed Edwardians to see themselves collectively. In a city as sprawling and divided as London, plays gave disparate groups a shared language of stories, jokes, and archetypes. Whether you were a clerk in the stalls or a duchess in a box, you saw versions of the English character played out before you. Brave, witty, slightly bumbling, but ultimately decent. Theatre was a mirror polished to reflect not necessarily reality but aspiration. Of course, not every production reinforced national pride. Some poked holes in the mythology, exposing hypocrisy and injustice. Shaw's plays, for instance, suggested that Britain's supposed moral superiority masked deep social inequality. Satirists skewered pompous elites, reminding audiences that the nation's greatness was sometimes a costume stitched together with sequins and bravado. But even criticism became part of the national identity. Britain, theatregoers believed, was strong enough to laugh at itself, or at least pretend it was. In the end, Edwardian theatre was less about telling audiences who they were, and more about suggesting who they wanted to be. Noble, witty, refined, modern, the stage offered a flattering portrait that audiences eagerly embraced, even if they suspected it was airbrushed. Plays told you who you were, or at least who you wished you were after 3 brandies, and that in its own way was as powerful as any empire. All crazes must end, even one as dazzling as Edwardian theatre. By the outbreak of World War I in 1914, the curtain was already falling on an era of sequins, witticisms, and velvet-lined grandeur. Yet Edwardian theatre didn't simply vanish into the dust of stage curtains. It left behind a legacy that reshaped British entertainment for generations to come. The curtain may have fallen, but the applause still echoes every time you binge-watch Netflix instead of going outside. The most immediate legacy was the rise of modern theatre as a serious cultural force. Before the Edwardians, drama had often been dismissed as mere diversion, something frivolous or even immoral. But the era's great playwrights, actors and managers elevated the stage into a respected institution. Shaw's biting social critiques, Barry's whimsical fantasies, and the spectacle-loving impresarios like Beerbohm Tree proved that theatre could be both popular and profound. By 1910, a night at the theatre was no longer just entertainment. It was a statement about taste, intellect, and modernity. Another lasting influence was on theatrical infrastructure itself. The wave of theatre construction during the Craze left London and regional cities with a treasure trove of ornate playhouses. Many of Frank Matcham's designs, with their sweeping balconies, electric lighting, and ingenious stage machinery, survived well into the 20th century and remain iconic today. The Edwardians didn't just build stages for their own enjoyment. They built the literal foundations of Britain's theatrical future. The Craze also shaped performance styles. The Edwardian love of spectacle and personality-driven productions paved the way for 20th century celebrity culture in acting. The star performer became a fixture of British entertainment, setting the stage, pun intended, for later screen idols. From Ellen Terry to Gerald du Maurier, the cult of the Edwardian star taught audiences to follow performers as much as plays, a cultural habit that carried seamlessly into the world of film. Speaking of film, the Edwardian theatre craze fed directly into the growth of cinema. Many early filmmakers drew inspiration from stagecraft, borrowing plots, actors, and even technical tricks from live productions. Edwardian theatres that had once staged musical comedies or melodramas soon found themselves screening silent films between live acts, blending the old and the new. When audiences embraced cinema as its own art form, it was Edwardian theatre's storytelling, staging, and star power that had laid the groundwork. Without Edwardian theatre, the early movie industry would have lacked both talent and an eager public primed to sit for hours and watch a story unfold. Edwardian theatre also left its mark on popular taste. The era's obsession with witty dialogue, sparkling comedies, and musical entertainments ensured that audiences expected more than solemn lectures from the stage. Humour, spectacle, and accessibility became central to British entertainment. Even serious playwrights learned to lace their works with enough wit or visual appeal to keep crowds engaged. That legacy endures. Whether in Noel Coward's drawing room comedies of the 1920s, or in the British sitcoms and dramas that still value a clever line above all else. Politically, the Edwardian stage played a role in pushing social debates into the public eye. Shaw's explorations of class inequality, Cicely Hamilton's critiques of women's economic struggles, and Galsworthy's calls for prison reform weren't just academic exercises. They laid groundwork for broader discussions in the decades to come. The Edwardian stage taught audiences that theatre could reflect real social issues, and that laughter and provocation could coexist. That tradition of theatre as conscience carried forward into the interwar years and beyond, influencing socially conscious drama on both stage and screen. And yet, Perhaps the most important legacy of the Edwardian theatre craze was the sense of shared cultural experience it fostered. In an age of rigid class divisions, theatre brought people of all ranks into the same building, reacting to the same stories. Boxes, stalls and galleries might have been worlds apart, but they still laughed at the same pratfalls and gasped at the same revelations. That democratic energy fed directly into the mass entertainment of the 20th century, from cinema to television. The idea that entire nations could be united by a shared story owes much to the Edwardian theatre's knack for mixing spectacle with accessibility. Of course, not everything endured. The sheer extravagance of some Edwardian productions with their papier-mâché giants, live animals and endlessly rotating scenery gave way to leaner, more modern styles as the century wore on. Early cinema quickly overtook the music hall in popularity, and the West End adapted to smaller, sharper productions. But even as styles changed, the Edwardian appetite for theatre as both escapism and reflection never disappeared. Today, when you sit down in a grand London theatre, you're still surrounded by Edwardian fingerprints in the architecture, in the electric glow of stage lighting, and in the very expectation that a night at the theatre will dazzle, amuse, and maybe even challenge you. The Edwardians taught Britain how to love theatre not just as a diversion, but as a cultural institution, something to be discussed, debated, and cherished long after the curtain fell. The craze might belong to the past, but its legacy lingers every time we laugh at a witty line, swoon over a star, or argue about whether entertainment should also educate. The Edwardian theatre taught us that culture could sparkle, sting, and still sell tickets. The curtain may have fallen, but the applause still echoes every time you binge-watch Netflix instead of going outside.